Hi, friends. Tonight, I invite you to close your eyes and drift back in time with me to a world once shaken by the thunder of wings and the distant hum of propellers. This is the story of Thomas Whitaker, an ordinary young man who, like so many, found himself aloft among clouds of war. Over 20 gentle chapters, we shall follow him, from boyhood dreams of flight to the roaring skies over Europe, discovering not only the trials of battle, but the quiet moments in between, the fleeting friendships, the soft echoes of hope that lingered even when the world burned below. Let us begin with Thomas's first encounter with the sky that would one day claim him as its own. Long before the silvered wings of Spitfires and Thunderbolts rose to weave their deadly dance above a war-torn continent, Thomas Whitaker was a boy of rolling fields and humble means. His childhood home lay at the edge of an English village named Linton by the Mere, where hedgerows thick with blackthorn sheltered rabbits, and where, on quiet days, the sound of a distant train blended with the chirrup of skylarks. Thomas's father, a railway clerk with ink-stained sleeves, often spoke little, his conversation reserved for the ledgers he carried to and from the station house. His mother, Margaret, was a gentle woman whose hands smelled faintly of lavender and flower. She sang as she mended trousers by the hearth, her voice a hush against the crackle of burning coal. It was Margaret who first taught Thomas to look upward. On crisp spring mornings, she would lift him to her hip and point to the sky, where contrails from the earliest training flights stitched fleeting threads of white against the pale blue dome. Before war was more than rumor, those aircraft were few and mostly civil. Yet to young Thomas, they were wings of wonder. When Thomas turned 10, a barnstorming airshow came to the nearby town of Market Drayton. His uncle, Albert, who ran a bicycle shop, brought him along. Thomas still remembered the jostling crowd, the scent of fried sausages and paraffin, and the way the earth trembled when the biplanes took off in pairs, looping one after the other in a noisy ballet above the grass airstrip. There, amid cheers and waving flags, the seed was planted. From that day on, whenever he trudged to school or did his chores in the garden, his eyes drifted skyward, tracing imaginary wings, envisioning the wind through his hair, and the world spread out below like a map waiting to be explored. Yet dreams have a curious way of lying dormant until stirred by history's cruel hand. When Thomas turned 17, Europe trembled under the shadow of a gathering storm. There were whispers of the Reich, of men with iron crosses pinned to breast pockets, of treaties torn as easily as parchment. Boys spoke of glory and duty with nervous laughter, but few believed the world would truly slip back into darkness. Thomas's chance came with the letter, that thin, cream-colored envelope that arrived one morning with the post. It bore the Royal Air Force crest, simple and stately. It was an invitation, or perhaps more honestly, a summons. The world he knew, the hedgerows, the meadows, his mother's lavender-scented hands, began to slip behind him like countryside seen from a moving train. Training was not glamorous at first. It was endless paperwork, medical checks, uniforms that smelled of starch and new wool, and days of standing in line with other boys, some younger than him, some older, all trying to mask their fear with bravado. They laughed too loudly, smoked cigarettes they did not yet enjoy, spoke of aerial duels they had only read about in the week-old papers. Nights in the barracks were hardest. The iron-framed beds squeaked as men shifted restlessly, their dreams filled not yet with engines and tracer fire, but with home, the mother's song, the father's silence, the small rooms they had left behind. In this sea of faces, Thomas found quiet solace with only the stars outside the narrow windows for company. But it was the first true flight that carved its memory deepest. At dawn, one pale March morning, he was led across a frosty field toward a squat little trainer plane, the Tiger Moth, her yellow paint dulled by wind and sun. The instructor, a broad-shouldered sergeant with wind-chafed cheeks, gave Thomas a nod that was more comforting than any word. The cockpit was cramped, the leather seat cracked, the harness stiff, but Thomas's pulse quickened, not with fear, but with something like reverence. When the propeller spun and the engine coughed awake, he felt his ribcage tighten, not with dread but anticipation. Then, with a jolt and a rush, the world fell away. Fields blurred into green and brown patchwork, hedgerows became threads, houses shrank to toys. The wind clawed at his cheeks, loud yet somehow exhilarating, as if it were trying to speak. Above him, the sky was wider than he had ever imagined, a cathedral of soft clouds and endless possibility. For the first time, Thomas understood why men risked everything to fly, why they would leave warm beds and bright hearths to ride the wind where only birds once dared. That first hour in the sky passed like a fleeting dream. The landing was awkward, jarring him back to earth with a bump that made his teeth click together, but he hardly noticed. His boots touched grass again, yet something within him remained aloft, circling high above, eager for the next flight. That night, as the barracks slept and rain tapped gently at the window panes, Thomas lay awake, the hum of the engine still thrumming in his bones. He stared at the wooden beams above, imagining the wings waiting for him at dawn. War was coming. Fear would come too. But in that hushed moment, his dreams of flight glowed brighter than the storm to come. The days that followed Thomas's first flight unfurled like a long ribbon of dawns and dusks, each marked by the slow mastering of wings and the hard discipline of men determined to shape boys into pilots. The tiger moth, with her canvas wings and forgiving nature, became a familiar friend, though she showed no mercy to carelessness. Every morning, before the sun had burned away the mist that clung to the hedgerows, Thomas and his fellow cadets assembled on the airfield. The instructors, some older men whose faces were weathered by years aloft, some not much older than Thomas himself, but hardened by experience, led them through the routines with an iron patience. They began with the simplest truths of flight: how air moved over wings, how lift was born and could just as quickly be stolen by a careless hand or a moment's panic. They spoke of stall speeds, the fickle nature of crosswinds, the way a machine would whisper its secrets if only one listened closely enough. Thomas listened well. He learned the rhythm of the propeller's pulse, the subtle shudder of the fuselage when she begged for more throttle, the slight resistance in the stick that spoke of wind currents, invisible to the eye but felt in the bones. Yet for all the theory and charts pinned to classroom walls, the true lessons lived in the sky. On one afternoon of pale spring sunlight, Thomas sat in the cockpit beside Sergeant Lennox, the same broad-shouldered instructor who had guided him through his first trembling takeoff. Lennox rarely spoke more than he must. His voice came like gravel dragged through oil, low, patient, firm. "Always remember, Whitaker," Lennox rumbled through the intercom as they climbed steadily toward a bank of scattered clouds. "She's your partner, not your servant. If you fight her, she'll kill you. Treat her gentle, and she'll carry you home." Thomas nodded, though Lennox could not see it. He gripped the stick lightly, feeling the plane's subtle lean as they tipped a wing into a wide, graceful turn. Below them, fields and roads spread like a quilt, green squares stitched together by thin lines of hedges and stone walls. Sheep scattered at the distant growl of their engine, tiny white flecks against the emerald. The lesson that day was spins and stalls, words that looked harmless on paper, yet in practice became a test of nerve and instinct. Lennox demonstrated first the sudden nose-up, the sluggish roll as lift betrayed them, the sickening tilt into a spiral dive that seemed to tear gravity open beneath them. Then it was Thomas's turn. He swallowed the rising tide of doubt as he pushed the stick forward, feeling the tiger moth buck slightly, wings complaining at the abrupt loss of speed. The nose lifted, the wind shrieked through the wires strung between wings, and then the bottom fell away. For a heartbeat, Thomas felt weightless. The sky tipped on its side, the horizon spun in drunken circles, and the roar of air filled his ears until it drowned out every thought. He forced himself to breathe, to remember the motions drilled into him by endless repetition on the ground. Rudder into the spin. Stick forward to break the stall. Gently. Not too much. Trust the machine. Trust himself. The wings shivered, then steadied. The spin broke. Gravity reasserted itself with a thump that left Thomas's stomach somewhere above him, but the tiger moth leveled out, her engine humming as if in quiet approval. Lennox gave no praise, only a grunt that might have been satisfaction or mere relief. Back on the airfield, Thomas staggered from the cockpit, legs trembling with the rush of adrenaline. A few of the other cadets waited their turn, faces pale under their leather helmets, trying not to show how their hands fidgeted with zips and buckles. No one wanted to be the one who failed the spin recovery. not just for fear of injury, but because failure here meant being sent back to ground crew, or worse yet, infantry duty far from the sky. Days turned into weeks, each punctuated by new lessons. Navigation by map and compass came next. The art of knowing precisely where you were when the world below looked like an endless patchwork of fields and villages, each more alike than the last. They learned to read the sun's angle, the drifting shadows of clouds, the way rivers curved like veins across the countryside. On the ground, there were lectures on engines, how each cylinder must be listened to, how spark plugs fouled, how to read the oil's color for hints of trouble. Maintenance officers barked at them for careless mistakes, for footprints left on wing roots, for any sign that they did not respect the fragile partnership between man and machine. At night, the barracks held the hush of exhausted bodies. Some boys wrote letters by the dim light of a single bulb, their pens scratching out promises to sweethearts and mothers they might never see again. Others lay awake, whispering nervously about rumors from the front, of pilots lost in dogfights over the channel, of parachutes that failed to open, of enemy aces who hunted the unwary. Thomas often rose before dawn, unable to sleep for the restless beating of his heart. He would slip outside, boots crunching on frost or soft mud, and stand at the edge of the airfield. There, under a dome of pinprick stars, he felt the cold wind on his cheeks and listened for the distant echo of engines. In those quiet moments, he thought of his mother's kitchen, the way her soft humming could drown out his father's silence. He thought of the barnstorming show, the dizzy loops that first showed him how small the world could look from above. He wondered, too, if he would ever see his village again, or if his name would be among those read aloud at Sunday services back home. But when the sun rose and the call came for the next lesson, he pushed those thoughts aside. There was no room in the cockpit for fear. Only wind, metal, and the fragile bond between pilot and plane. And so Thomas Whitaker rose again into the morning sky, his heart bound to the wind that promised both freedom and danger in equal measure. Spring surrendered to early summer, and with the turning of the seasons, Thomas Whitaker found himself no longer alone in his solitary wonder for the sky. Among the rows of khaki uniforms and canvas flight jackets, friendships were stitched together like the seams of their aircraft, strong enough, they hoped, to hold fast when the wind howled hardest. It began with James "Jem" Calder, a wiry lad from Glasgow, whose accent curled his words into a warm lilt that made the coldest morning briefings feel less harsh. Jem had a grin that could coax laughter from even the most stone-faced instructors, and a talent for cards that emptied the pockets of many a careless cadet. They first spoke properly after a punishing day of circuits and landings. Thomas had returned to the mess hall, cheeks still raw from the wind, when he found Jem hunched over a cup of weak tea, muttering curses about an instructor who insisted on repeating forced landings until the sun threatened to sink behind the distant hedgerows. "Suppose we'll be landing on clouds next if he has his way," Jem said, glancing up as Thomas sat opposite. His grin flickered in the low light of the mess. "You're Whitaker, aye? The quiet lad from Linton or someplace?" "Linton by the Mere," Thomas answered, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "And you're Calder, the lad who owes half the barracks their cigarette rations." "Aye, but they keep playing me," Jem said with a shrug, raising his mug in a mock toast. "Daft souls, all of 'em. Fancy a game yourself?" From that night on, Thomas and Jem drifted together between lessons and flights, the slow companionship of shared cigarettes, borrowed pens, and quiet confessions spoken in the dark when sleep refused to come. They were joined soon enough by two more. Alfred "Alfie" Green, a farmer's son from Norfolk whose broad shoulders seemed built more for hay bales than cockpit harnesses, and Peter Fairchild, the son of a solicitor from Kent, who carried a dog-eared book of poetry tucked into his flight bag. They were an unlikely quartet, bound not by birthplace or upbringing, but by the knowledge that they would soon be asked to trust one another in ways no schoolyard friendship could ever demand. Together they studied the endless charts, argued over navigation problems, and laughed when their exhausted minds turned sensible words into nonsense. Some nights, after a day of lessons and practice flights, they sneaked out past the watchful eye of the duty officer to lie on the cold grass at the airfield's edge. There, with their jackets for pillows and breath rising like ghostly wisps in the chill night, they traded dreams and worries in equal measure. Jem spoke often of Glasgow's crowded streets, of the tenement where his mother still waited for the telegram she prayed would never come. Alfie confessed he missed the smell of wet soil and the quiet, honest labor of fields that demanded sweat, but never blood. Peter read lines from his battered book in a soft, almost embarrassed voice, quoting Tennyson and Brooke while the others stared at the stars in a hush. Thomas listened more than he spoke. When pressed, he shared stories of his mother's soft humming and the barnstorming show that set his heart on this path. He told them of the hedgerows he longed to fly over again when the war was done, though none of them dared say aloud what they all knew, that for some, that return might never come. Day by day, the instructors pressed them harder. Now there were mock dogfights, young pilots pairing off in the sky, learning the deadly dance of turn and counter-turn, of how to use the sun's glare and the cloud's cover. They flew in pairs, practicing radio chatter that would soon be all that linked them when the enemy came roaring in from the horizon. Thomas and Jem made a natural team. Jem's brash confidence balanced Thomas's quiet precision. Jem loved the thrill of the chase, rolling his plane into tight turns, laughing into his microphone as Thomas warned him to keep his altitude. When they touched down, they'd trade playful jabs, shoving each other's helmets and boasting who'd have the upper hand next time. Yet woven into every carefree moment was the knowledge that these lessons were no game. Each drill, each tight spiral through clouded skies, brought them a heartbeat closer to the reality that soon the bullets would not be blanks, the enemy not a friendly instructor, but a pilot determined to kill or be killed. Rumors trickled through the base like whispers on the wind, of raids over France, of squadrons scrambled to intercept bombers that droned relentlessly toward London's sleeping streets. Some mornings, instructors who seemed unshakable returned from postings abroad, their eyes distant, voices lower than before. When pressed by curious cadets, they only shrugged and said, "You'll know soon enough." One dusk, as Thomas stood by the hangars watching a Spitfire being wheeled into the maintenance bay, he overheard a pair of mechanics talking in low tones. One mentioned a young pilot who hadn't come back from his final check flight. Engine trouble, they said, or maybe the weather turned foul too quickly. The details were vague, but the unspoken truth settled in Thomas's chest like a stone. Not all dangers came from enemy guns. That night, the barracks felt smaller somehow, the bunks closer, the air heavy with unspoken questions. Thomas lay awake long after the others drifted into uneasy sleep. Outside, the wind rattled the thin window panes, carrying with it the distant drone of an aircraft engine heading east toward the Black Sea of night. He thought of his mother, of Linton's hedgerows silvered by moonlight. He thought of Jem's laughter, Alfie's patient silence, Peter's soft recitations under the stars. He wondered how many of them would see the war's end, how many would ride the wind home when the last dogfight was done. In the darkness, Thomas reached out to the thin air above his blanket, tracing with his fingertip an imaginary wing, feeling the hum of the engine in his bones. Tomorrow they would climb again into the vast cathedral of the sky, where fear and freedom lived side by side on the edge of each spinning propeller. Summer pressed on with a stubborn warmth that made the airfields shimmer at midday and left sweat pooling beneath leather helmets. By now, Thomas and his comrades could land and take off almost without thought. The gentle tiger moths gave way to fiercer steeds, Harvards and Hurricanes that snarled instead of hummed, engines coughing black smoke when pushed too hard, their heavier frames demanding more respect. The instructors, once patient with their mistakes, turned sterner by the hour. There were no soft words for a young pilot who fumbled his rudder in a tight turn or misjudged his speed on final approach. Mistakes that once brought laughter now brought icy glares and an extra round in the air the following day. It was after one such grueling session that Thomas and Jem sat side by side on the low wall by the hangar, flight jackets unzipped, boots dusty, their gloves tossed between them. The sky overhead was bruised with gathering storm clouds, a wind carrying the faint tang of rain. "You reckon we'll get our orders soon?" Jem asked, his voice oddly quiet for someone whose words usually filled the silence. Thomas shrugged, brushing a fleck of dried mud from his sleeve. "They've kept us this long. Must mean they're waiting for something. Or someone," Jem said with a wry smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Heard old Lennox saying there's a push coming. Big raids. They'll want fresh wings." They fell into silence, watching a flight of 3 Harvards taxi out, engines coughing into life. The propellers blurred to silver discs as they lumbered down the field and lifted off one by one, each rising into the low ceiling of cloud until they vanished like moths swallowed by smoke. Behind them, Alfie emerged from the hangar, wiping oil from his hands with a scrap of cloth. He'd spent the afternoon helping a ground crew patch a fuel leak. Punishment for landing too hard on the north runway, bursting a tire and giving the mechanics an extra headache. "You two sitting there like ghosts," Alfie grumbled good-naturedly, dropping onto the wall beside Thomas. "If the sergeant finds you loafing about, you'll be polishing the latrines till the invasion's over." Jem snorted. "Let him come. I'll trade him my boots for a warm bed." They sat that way until the first drops of rain tapped softly on their shoulders, each man lost in thoughts he did not share. When the wind shifted, it carried the low drone of bombers passing somewhere far off, a steady thrum that spoke of distant cities where searchlights sliced the night sky and sirens wailed families out of restless sleep. That evening brought the orders. The mess hall had emptied early, the last cups of tea drained and the tables cleared of crumbs and cigarette butts. Thomas, Jem, Alfie, and Peter lingered by the notice board, reading names pinned there in neat rows. Next to each was a unit designation, a departure date, and a squadron badge carefully inked in blue and black. Thomas traced his finger along the list until he found his own name. Whitaker, T.A., number 92 Squadron RF. The same line held Jem's name beside it, and the tightness in Thomas's chest eased a fraction. Alfie's name was there too, though Peter's was not. Peter lingered beside them, his thumb pressed into the spine of his ever-present poetry book. His name appeared under a different heading, Observer Corps, Coastal Command. Not a fighter pilot's lot, but a watchman's, scanning the gray seas for shadows of submarines and unwelcome silhouettes slipping beneath the waves. They didn't speak of what it meant, that Peter would not fly beside them when the sky turned to iron. Instead, they slipped out of the mess and wandered toward the edge of the field where a line of old trucks rested under the gloom of the gathering rain. There, under the half-hearted shelter of a willow tree, they shared a single cigarette, passing it back and forth while the drizzle found its way beneath their collars. Peter broke the hush first. "You'll all come back," he said, not looking up. "One day we'll sit at some seaside pub. I'll buy the first round. Thomas, you can buy the second. You'll be an officer by then. They'll pay you too much to fly those pretty Spitfires." Jem laughed, a low, tired chuckle. "If they pay him too much, he'll just lose it all to my card games." Alfie grunted. "Better not. I'll be the one dragging him out of your bad bets, same as always." They laughed again, though it didn't ring quite true. The rain picked up, drumming on the willow leaves above them like 1,000 soft taps of distant machine guns. When the cigarette burned down to the filter, Peter tossed it aside and closed his poetry book with a quiet finality. "Be kind to the sky," he said softly. "She doesn't care who you are, but she'll hold you if you ask her right." No one quite knew what to say to that, so they clasped hands in the gloom one by one, the simple touch saying what words could not. That night, back in the barracks, they packed their kit bags in silence. Each man laid out his boots, his cap, the small comforts of home. A photograph, a worn letter, a medal from a father's war before. Thomas lingered over his mother's photograph longest. Her smile, fixed in soft sepia, seemed at once near enough to touch and impossibly far away. When the lamps dimmed and the barracks fell quiet, Thomas lay awake listening to the wind push at the window frames. Tomorrow they would climb into faster machines, their engines tuned for war's cruel necessity. The training grounds would fall away behind them, replaced by airfields closer to the channel, closer to the front lines where the sky turned red with the dawn. Outside, rain pooled in the muddy ruts between the hangars. Somewhere beneath that endless stretch of black sky, the enemy waited, unseen but certain. And in that heavy silence, Thomas felt the first real taste of what it meant to be a fighter pilot. Not just the thrill of flight, but the quiet, relentless promise that every farewell might be the last. At dawn, the train that carried Thomas, Jem, and Alfie rattled southward through the misty folds of the English countryside. Their breath steamed the windows as they peered out at fields still heavy with dew, hedgerows flickering past like old memories refusing to linger. Inside their carriage, the air smelled of damp wool and ration tins cracked open for an early meal. Jem balanced a battered pack of cards on his knee, but never bothered to deal them out. Alfie leaned against the window, broad shoulders hunched, eyes closed, though Thomas doubted he slept. Every few miles, the train slowed through sleepy stations where porters in frayed uniforms heaved crates marked ordnance and medical into waiting lorries. Sometimes they passed convoys on narrow lanes, columns of trucks crawling beneath camouflage nets, the low growl of engines swallowed by hedgerows, bursting with wildflowers that seemed almost defiant in their brightness. No one spoke of where they were headed, though each man held the truth in the tight line of his jaw. Their orders were stamped with the crest of Fighter Command and the name of an airfield near the southern coast, a place that would be home until the sky deemed otherwise. When the train finally hissed into the small station at West Langdon, the platform bristled with movement. Ground crew in greasy coveralls loaded crates of spare parts onto open wagons. Pilots disembarking from other trains shuffled stiff-legged under kit bags heavy with the weight of new rank insignia and private hopes pressed between folded uniforms. A corporal with a clipboard barked names above the din. Thomas answered to his own with a clear voice that still felt oddly foreign to his ears. As if the boy who once dreamed of barnstorming, Shows had stepped aside for this new man in polished boots and an officer's sidearm. A lorry waited beyond the gates, canvas sides rolled up to reveal a bench where men jostled for space with duffel bags and flight helmets. Thomas climbed in beside Jem, who immediately poked his elbow into Alfie's ribs just to earn a low grunt of protest. They might have been schoolboys off to camp if not for the hush that settled between their jokes. A hush that deepened each time the lorry rattled over a pothole, or the sound of distant engines cracked the salt-tanged air. West Langdon Airfield revealed itself first as a speckle of hangars rising from fields of beaten grass. A cluster of Nissen huts formed the living quarters, their corrugated roofs flashing silver in the sun. To the east, the runways lay stark and wide, the far edges blurred where the land sloped down toward the channel. The smell of oil, petrol, and the sea tangled on the wind like a promise. An officer met them by the dispersal hut. Flight Lieutenant Graham, a lean man with a hawk's eyes and a moustache that bristled like iron filings. His handshake was brief, his welcome briefer. "You're here to fly, not sit about swapping stories," he said after the roll call. "Mess is over there. Billets are down that path. Pick a bunk and stow your kit sharpish. Wheels up for familiarization at 1600. Dismissed." And that was all the greeting the new pilots received from their new home. Their billet was a low hut that smelled faintly of old tobacco and fresh whitewash. 4 narrow bunks stood against each wall, blankets folded tight, and pillows that looked as if they'd been pressed with a steam iron 10 minutes before their arrival. Thomas claimed the bunk nearest the small window, tossing his kit bag down and resting his cap on the thin pillow. Jem dropped onto the bunk opposite, boots still on, arms flung wide as if claiming the room as his own by sheer force of posture. Alfie remained at the door a moment longer, eyes roaming the cramped quarters as if committing every knot in the wooden beams to memory. Then he stepped inside, setting his duffel carefully at the foot of the last empty bed. There was no time to linger. The moment their boots found the floor, an airman with a clipboard arrived to herd them toward the dispersal hut. There, beneath the roar of Merlins warming up on the hardstand, they were introduced to their new machines. Spitfires. Sleek and lethal, their olive drab and gray coats glistening under the sun. For Thomas, seeing a Spitfire up close was like beholding a falcon at rest. Every line purposeful, every surface taut with quiet menace. He ran his hand along the cool metal of the fuselage, fingers brushing the painted roundel that marked him now not as a student, but as a fighter pilot. Flight Lieutenant Graham's voice broke the spell. "No time for gawking. You'll know her well enough soon. Every bolt and rivet. First sortie's just a run over the channel. No heroics. Keep your wits about you, stay tight to your wingman, and don't get clever. The clever ones are the first we lose." Thomas nodded, adjusting his helmet strap as Jem gave him a lopsided grin and nudged his shoulder. Alfie, silent as ever, climbed into his cockpit with a care that suggested he understood exactly what he was being trusted with. Moments later, the ground crew pulled the chocks away and the line of Spitfires taxied out, noses dipping slightly as they turned toward the wide mouth of the runway. Thomas felt the vibration of the Merlin engine run up through the seat, into his chest, as if the aircraft were breathing with him. At the tower's signal, they thundered forward one by one, wheels biting into the grass before lifting free, trading the earth for the vast pale sky that waited beyond the airfield's edge. They climbed through scattered cloud, engines roaring in staggered chorus. Below, the fields gave way to chalk cliffs, bright teeth against the restless gray of the channel. Beyond lay France, enemy territory, just a few minutes, flight, and a lifetime's worth of danger away. There, above the shimmering water, Thomas eased his grip on the stick, felt the slipstream tug at his wings, and looked left to see Jem's Spitfire tucked close, Alfie just behind, the sun glinting off their canopies like polished glass. In that moment, the world below seemed impossibly small. The war, the fear, even the memory of Linton's hedgerows blurred to nothing but a distant green smear. Here was the promise he'd carried since boyhood, the freedom of open sky, the thunder of the machine trusted to his hands. Yet even here, the horizon held a darker truth. Somewhere ahead lay the enemy. Other young men strapped into engines of steel and fire, waiting with the same hopes, the same hunger, the same promise that the sky might keep them safe. As the coastline fell away behind him, Thomas breathed deep and tasted salt on the wind. He was no longer just a student of flight, no longer a boy dreaming beneath barnstorming wings. He was a fighter pilot at the edge of a storm only the sky could truly know. Thomas's first true mission began not with fanfare, but with a quiet knock on the billet door before dawn. The corridor outside was dark, lit only by a single bulb that flickered when the wind rattled the window frames. Jem grumbled awake, pulling his blanket over his head before remembering what the knock meant. Alfie sat up slowly, boots already half-laced from habit born of restless nights. The mess hall at that hour smelled of burnt toast and strong tea. Men spoke in hushed voices, their words half swallowed by the clatter of cutlery and the scrape of tin mugs on rough wooden tables. The mission board near the far wall bore a chalked-out flight plan. A patrol over the channel's narrow waist, near a stretch the pilots simply called the Gap. Thomas read the briefing twice, committing each waypoint to memory. The intelligence was plain. A German reconnaissance flight had been spotted skimming the waves at dawn, mapping coastal defenses or searching for shipping lanes ripe for U-boat hunting. They were to intercept, discourage, and if the enemy turned stubborn, to engage. In the briefing room, Flight Lieutenant Graham laid out the orders with his usual clipped precision. Keep formation tight. Do not stray. Do not chase a lone kite inland. Remember, the channel works both ways. Too far east and it's a long swim home if you're lucky. He paused then, eyes moving from man to man. For a moment his stern mask lifted just enough for Thomas to see the weight behind it. The knowledge that some faces here might not gather around the mess tables that evening. By first light, the Spitfires were already lined up on the wet grass, their wings beaded with dew that caught the rising sun. Mechanics bustled from nose to tail, checking fuel lines and ammunition drums with quick, practiced hands. A fitter gave Thomas a small thumbs up as he hauled himself into the cockpit, helmet strap snug beneath his chin. His breath misted inside the canopy glass. He watched the other pilots settle into their machines, gloved hands flicking switches and adjusting harness straps. Jem, 2 planes down, shot him a grin that might have been more nervous than it looked. Alfie gave only a tight nod, eyes fixed ahead. At the tower's signal, the engines roared awake in staggered bursts. The soft dawn shattered by the fierce growl of Merlins clearing their throats. The propeller blurred before Thomas's eyes, a spinning disk that made the world beyond shimmer and warp. He felt the vibrations run through his boots, into the thin skin of his chest, a heartbeat shared between man and machine. He nudged the throttle forward, feeling the gentle protest as the Spitfire rolled onto the runway line, wheels bumping over ruts before settling. The tower's green flare rose, drifting like a dying star against the brightening sky. Thomas pushed the throttle open, and the world lurched backward, grass smearing to a green blur, the wind pressing his shoulders deeper into the seat. The wheels left the earth with a sigh, folding inward with a reassuring thunk. He was airborne again, but this time no instructor's calm voice murmured through the headset. No training spins or lazy loops for practice's sake. Ahead lay the wide silver sheet of the channel, quiet in its deceptive calm. The squadron formed up in a loose V. Thomas found his place at Jem's wingtip, Alfie a little behind and high. They climbed steadily, crossing the chalk cliffs in minutes, the sea opening beneath them, flecked with whitecaps, and the far glimmer of fishing boats hugging the coast. The radio crackled with clipped reports, bearing checks, altitude calls. Thomas focused on the steady note of his engine, the way the stick pulsed faintly with the Spitfire's breath. He reminded himself to scan the sky, every arc of blue hiding the possibility of an enemy shape. It came sudden and small, a speck low and fast skimming the wave tops. Then another. Black crosses glinting on silver wings, recon planes, likely Messerschmitt Bf-110s armed just enough to fight back if pressed. Bandits. It's 2 o'clock low, came Graham's voice, steady and cold as a church bell. Tally-ho. Thomas's heart kicked once, hard enough that he thought it might break through his ribs. He eased the nose down, with Jem matching beside him. The squadron fanned out, sun at their backs. The first rule, taught again and again. Keep the sun behind you. Make the enemy squint at his death. The Messerschmitts must have seen them because they broke formation, one banking left, the other right, trying to split the Spitfires wide. Thomas stuck to Jem's wing as they followed the right-hand target. The sea rushed up beneath them as they dove, the engine's roar vibrating every bolt and rib in the cockpit. Machine guns flickered awake. The tracers stitched bright lines across the sky, trailing smoke and the brief spark of metal when they found their mark. Thomas squeezed the trigger, feeling the shudder as his own gun spat rounds through the wings, spent casings rattling away into the wind. The Messerschmitt jinked hard, its rear gunner sending a spray of bullets that cracked past Thomas's canopy. He bit down on the taste of fear and nudged the stick tighter, wings flexing as he rolled to stay behind the fleeing plane. Beside him, Jem whooped into the radio, a sharp, breathless laugh that cut the tension for a single heartbeat. Together they pressed the attack, herding the German down toward the wave tops. Another burst from Thomas's guns sparked across the Messerschmitt's engine cowling. Smoke belched out in a twisting plume. At the last moment, the German pilot pulled up sharply, trying to claw altitude. Jem darted in, gave one quick burst of his own, and the enemy's right wing tore open, a ragged wound that spun the plane into a sickening corkscrew toward the sea. Thomas followed the shape until it vanished behind a cresting swell. It was over in seconds, yet his heart pounded as though he'd run miles. He scanned the sky for Jem. There he was, banking left, hand raised in a brief, triumphant wave. They climbed back to altitude, regrouping with Alfie and the others. One Messerschmitt had escaped inland, trailing smoke but alive, a warning to the next sortie that the Channel's sky would not be given up easily. When they returned to West Langdon, the Spitfires touched down in staggered thumps, wheels squealing against the runway's patchy tarmac. Mechanics and ground crew gathered, eyes flicking from the bullet holes in Thomas's wing to the scorch marks on Jem's fuselage. But the pilots climbed down with the same boots, the same kit bags, the same hands that trembled only a little as they reached for tea poured by the mess steward. In the dispersal hut, Thomas sat alone for a moment, helmet in his lap, the hum of the Merlin engine still alive in his bones. He thought of the Messerschmitt spinning toward the sea, of the faceless boy inside it who had dreamed his own dreams of wings and sky. Outside, the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the field. Tomorrow would bring another scramble, another patrol, another chance for the sky to decide who would come home. The days after that first clash passed in a haze of restless sorties and briefings chalked out on cold, gray mornings. Each dawn carried with it the same routine. The mess hall's weak tea, the muttered jokes, the quiet clatter of cutlery on tin. The same ritual, men pulling on flight suits stiff with salt and sweat, fingers fumbling helmet straps as if muscle and canvas might shield them from what waited beyond the airfield's ragged edge. Thomas grew accustomed to the new weight in his chest, the pulsing truth that each takeoff might be the last. It did not dull him to fear, but rather threaded itself into every breath, until fear felt as normal as the roar of the Merlin, as normal as the oil-smudged hands of the ground crew waving him off with half-smiles they never seemed quite able to hold. One morning, the squadron found itself scrambled before breakfast. Reports of incoming bombers, Heinkels with fighter escort, crossing the channel under a pale dawn like carrion birds in search of soft targets along the coast. They rose in tight formation, engines howling, the coastline slipping behind them in rippling bands of chalk and sand. Sunlight danced on the sea, masking the shapes that lurked beyond the horizon. Then the first black specks appeared, swelling from dots into hulking silhouettes bristling with defensive guns. Thomas felt his throat tighten around a half-formed prayer as Flight Lieutenant Graham's voice cut through the static. "No lone heroics, boys. Stick to your wingmen. Keep them close, and keep your eyes wide." Alfie's calm reply came through first, a solid presence in the invisible web between them. Jem's voice followed, as bright and reckless as ever, a defiant laugh snatched away by the wind. The Spitfires fell upon the bombers like hawks, diving through the swarm of escorting fighters. Tracer rounds stitched the blue sky with threads of fire. The world shrank to the canopy's glass arc, the hammering rattle of guns, the judder of wings bucking under sudden turns. Thomas locked onto a Heinkel's belly, squeezed the trigger, watched panels tear away in sparks and smoke. Somewhere off his wing, a Messerschmitt rolled into view, guns blazing. He banked hard, pulling the Spitfire into a punishing climb, the G-forces pressing him deep into his harness. A second later, Jem's voice barked in his headset, "I've got him! Brake right, Tommy! Brake right!" Thomas obeyed. The Messerschmitt peeled off under Jem's onslaught, diving for the clouds below. It happened too fast for thanks. Already Thomas was rolling again, hunting for Alfie's silhouette among the swirling melee. When the call came to regroup, the air was littered with drifting smoke and the slow, dreadful plummet of burning wreckage, enemy and friend alike. They turned for home with empty guns and engines coughing from strained throttles, each man scanning the channel for the friendly shape of his squadron mates. The runway at West Langdon waited like a thin promise on the far side of the water. Thomas touched down first, bouncing once before the wheels bit properly, the Spitfire rattling down the grass strip as his heart thudded against his ribs. Jem landed next, taxiing up alongside, his canopy already open, that same reckless grin trying its best to hide the tremor in his hands. But Alfie's plane did not appear. They waited by the dispersal hut as the ground crews scoured the horizon. The radio sputtered with fragments of calls, half-heard echoes from picket ships watching the sky with binoculars pressed to salt-chapped eyes. Nothing came back but static. Hours later, Graham gathered them inside the hut, the smell of stale tea and engine oil pressing close as rain began to drum on the tin roof. His voice was quiet, the orders routine, sorties to fly, new maps to mark, repairs to oversee. But his eyes lingered on the empty chair where Alfie should have been, boots propped beneath it, flight helmet left behind on the shelf by his bunk. No one spoke of it that evening. The mess hall rang with the forced clatter of cutlery, the rattle of tin mugs, the laughter too loud and too sharp around tables worn smooth by restless elbows. Jem shuffled a pack of cards with a half-smile that did not reach his eyes, dealing out hands they barely played, the pile of winnings untouched in the middle of the table. Thomas found himself drifting outside when the hall grew too warm, the smoke too thick. He stood by the line of Spitfires, their wings slick with dew and rain under the dim floodlights. He ran his palm along the leading edge of a wing, feeling the tiny dents and scorches that told the story of what the machine had endured for him. He thought of Alfie's bunk, the photo of his parents pinned above it, a letter half-written tucked inside a battered notebook. No telegram would come tonight. Tomorrow, perhaps, or the day after, when the sea gave up its secret, or the enemy's confirmation arrived by radio intercept. He wondered if Alfie had time to think of the farm back in Norfolk when his engine failed, or when the bullets found his fuel line. Or if he'd only seen the wide, cold face of the channel, rising up to swallow him as gently as the sky had once lifted him. Back inside the billet, Thomas sat on his bunk long after Jem's breathing settled into the ragged pattern of exhausted sleep. He glanced at the empty space where Alfie's kit bag still rested. Boots placed neatly side by side as if waiting for their owner to step back into them at dawn. He knew tomorrow's board would bear another chalked name, another new face, eager and fresh in an ill-fitting flight suit, eyes wide with the dream of wings. And when the sun rose, they would rise with it again. Engines roaring, propellers clawing at the mist, the thin promise of return written only in the fragile arc of their formations against the waiting sky. Outside, the channel's winds rattled the loose panes of the hut's small window. Thomas lay back on his bunk, staring at the ceiling beams. He let the ghost of Alfie's voice drift through his thoughts one last time. The steady laugh, the soft Norfolk drawl, the quiet man who spoke little but always stayed close when the sky turned black with enemy wings. Tomorrow, Thomas knew, the chair would still be empty. But the squadron would fly. It always would. The following days brought more missions and fewer words. The skies over the channel remained restless, the soft summer clouds torn apart by the passage of bombers and fighters weaving deadly trails through the blue. Each dawn found Thomas at his bunk before the knock on the door. Boots already laced, helmet resting by his side, like a sentinel waiting to crown him once more in the hard embrace of the cockpit. Jem's laughter came less easily now, though he worked at it with the same reckless energy he once spent at the card table. He filled silences with stories about Glasgow's smoky streets, about a girl named Mary he claimed waited for him by the docks, though whether Mary was real or another invention spun from midnight fatigue, Thomas never asked. A new man arrived 3 mornings after Alfie's chair went empty. His name was Harold Finch, fresh from a different training station up north, his cheeks still touched with the softness of a boy not yet pressed hard by the sky's cold judgment. He walked into the billet carrying a battered kit bag, eyes flicking nervously between the bunks until he found the empty one and laid claim to it without a word. Jem offered him a grin sharp enough to slice through the hush. "Don't mind the ghosts, Harry," he said, tossing him a crumpled pack of cigarettes. "We keep the best bunk for new lads, so you know who to thank when the roof leaks." Harry laughed, though it came out more like a cough. He sat cross-legged on his bunk, pulling apart the pack to light one with trembling fingers. Thomas watched him with a quiet, careful study, the way his gaze darted to the empty shelf above Alfie's old space, the way his eyes dropped whenever someone mentioned the channel. Outside, the Spitfires crouched under canvas covers, their wings beaded with early rain. By mid-morning, the call came to fly. Recon again. The endless game of cat and mouse with the Luftwaffe's scouts, probing the coast for weakness. Thomas and Harry were paired together, wingmen by necessity rather than trust. Jem flew to their port side, weaving back and forth like an impatient hound held too long on a short lead. They lifted off in a staggered line, wheels thumping against the thin strip of tarmac before pulling free. The air smelled of salt and oil, the canopy glass rattling as the Spitfire rose through ragged bands of gray. At altitude, Thomas stole a glance across the formation. Harry's plane held position, but only just. The slight waver of his wingtip told Thomas more than any radio call could. A man still fighting the machine, still learning its moods and sharp corners, hoping the sky would forgive a misstep. Their patrol arced toward the thin crescent of the French coast, where the channel's waves darkened near the shallows. Beneath them, merchant convoys crawled along sea lanes watched by corvettes and destroyers, their wakes churning the water into white scars that faded slowly behind them. The call came soft and sudden, Graham's voice through the static. "Bandits, Angels 12, heading north. Tighten up." Thomas eased his throttle, shifting closer to Harry's port wing. The new pilot's head snapped around, helmet pressed tight to the canopy glass, eyes wide as he tried to match Thomas's line. Jem's voice crackled in, all teeth and thinly disguised nerves. "See them, Tommy? Coming in like flies on a Sunday joint." And there they were, 6 dark shapes growing fat against the sun, Messerschmitts running in aggressive sweep. The Spitfires spread slightly, not enough to break formation, but enough to let each man find the sky he needed to fight in. When the Germans saw them, they broke apart like startled birds, one pair banking high, the others fanning out to tangle them up. Thomas rolled left to match a Messerschmitt diving through cloud, feeling the sudden gut pull of G-force as he pressed the stick hard, wings screaming in protest. Harry stayed close, but not close enough. Thomas caught him slipping wide in the corner of his eye, the rookie's plane drifting off the safe arc, wing dipping just enough to make him an easy mark. A Messerschmitt pounced from above, guns lighting the air with a quick flash of orange. Bullets scored across Harry's starboard wing, punching holes through canvas and metal with a dull thud that Thomas felt in his teeth. "Brake, right! Brake, Harry!" Thomas shouted into the mic, voice hoarse over the rush of wind and engine. Harry jolted back into line, rolling the Spitfire hard, too hard. The tail shuddered, the nose dipped, and for a second Thomas feared he would see the young man tumble straight into the channel. But Harry pulled up at the last breath, the Spitfire groaning as it leveled. Thomas rolled above him, cutting across the Messerschmitt's path, thumb jabbing the trigger. Tracer fire bit at the sky, forcing the German to break off with a burst of black smoke trailing from its cowling. "Stick to me, Harry. Tighten up," Thomas barked. The words rough but laced with something gentler beneath. The silent vow he would not see another empty chair when they landed. The skirmish dissolved as quickly as it had flared. The Messerschmitts pulled off, low on fuel or simply unwilling to press a fight now that the element of surprise was lost. The Spitfires circled once, twice, then banked west toward home, the channel's gray sheen welcoming them back with a steady hush beneath the wings. When they touched down, Harry climbed from his cockpit, helmet in hand, eyes blinking too fast, as if they refused to settle on any one thing for fear of what they might see. Thomas approached him in the shadow of the wing, hand on his shoulder, feeling the fine tremor that ran through the young pilot's bones. "You kept her flying. That's what matters," Thomas said quietly. Harry only nodded, breath hitching as he stared at the ragged holes stitched through his wing. Later, in the mess hall, Jem thumped a mug of tea in front of Harry with a grin that for once carried no bite. "First holes are the worst. You'll get used to them, or you won't. Either way, you're here tonight, and that's all the channel's getting of you today." Harry managed a thin smile. Outside, the sun dipped low, painting the runway in long, bruised shadows. The Spitfires rested side by side, the day's fresh scars waiting for the mechanic's careful hands. And inside, in that small circle of worn bunks and folded kit bags, Thomas understood how every new wingman was a vow half-whispered between men who flew too close to loss. A promise that for tonight at least, the chairs would remain filled, the ghosts kept at bay a little while longer. In the hush between sorties, Thomas found himself returning to old habits, the quiet ritual of writing letters he rarely had the courage to send. Each evening, when the mess hall had emptied and Jem's laughter had faded into the ragged chorus of snores from bunk to bunk, Thomas would sit cross-legged on his blanket, knees pressed against a battered kit bag, pen scratching across paper yellowed by oil and sea damp. He wrote first to his mother, though the words rarely moved beyond polite lies. "All is well here. The airfield is quiet. The food good enough." He described the dawn mist over the channel, the scent of salt in the hangars, the way the Spitfire's Merlin engine felt like a living thing in his chest. But he never wrote of Alfie's empty bunk, or the sight of tracer fire tearing open the sky above the waves. He did not tell her of the Messerschmitt spinning toward the water, nor the sudden drop in his stomach when Harry nearly joined it. Sometimes he folded the pages carefully, addressed them to Mrs. Margaret Whittaker, Linton by the Mere, then tucked them back into the inside pocket of his tunic instead of the outgoing mail sack. Perhaps he believed he might deliver them himself one day, or perhaps he knew some truths were kinder left unsaid. One night, rain battered the tin roof of the billet, tapping out a restless rhythm that matched the thoughts turning in his head. Jem snored gently on the bunk opposite, one arm thrown over his eyes, boots still on as always. Harry lay 2 bunks down, wrapped tight in his blanket, shoulders tense even in sleep. A single lamp glowed on the table between them, its soft halo pooling on the pages spread beneath Thomas's hand. He began another letter. This one he addressed not to his mother but to Peter. Peter of the soft voice and pocket poetry, who watched the waves from his observer's post somewhere along the cold northern coast. Thomas imagined him now, notebook balanced on his knee, pen moving in small, careful loops as he sketched out lines about the restless sea or the slow drift of gulls above the dunes. "Peter," he wrote, "you'd hate the mess hall here. The tea is worse than we ever complained about, and Jem is still a terrible cheat at cards. You'd laugh to see him bluff half the squadron out of their cigarette rations in 5 minutes, then give it all back when he's won, just to see their faces." He paused, pen hovering above the paper, listening to the rain drum harder against the corrugated roof. A gust rattled the window near his bunk, cold air slipping in to lift the corner of the page like a quiet breath urging him to continue. "Alfie's gone," he added then, the words stark and final on the clean paper. It happened over the gap. One moment he was there, and then he wasn't. I wish I'd told him more. About Linton. About the barnstorm. About the first time I saw the sky open wide enough to hold all my fear and hope at once. He'd have listened. He always did. Outside, a distant engine growled as a late patrol came home across the darkened field. The sound faded, leaving only the hush of the rain and the faint creak of the billet's timber frame settling under the wind. Thomas looked down at what he'd written. He imagined Peter reading it by lamplight, that small, sad smile tugging at his mouth, his thumb marking the next line in his dog-eared book of Brooke or Tennyson. Peter would have known what to say. Not some bright lie to chase the dark away, but something softer, truer. A reminder that grief did not mean the sky owned him entirely. He folded the page but did not seal it. He tucked it into the same pocket as his mother's unsent words, the paper warm against his chest. One day, he told himself, he would find Peter on some quiet shore where the wind smelled of brine instead of burnt oil, where gulls wheeled and cried above sand dunes untrodden by boots or fear. There he would hand over the letter, and Peter would read it aloud in his calm voice, giving weight to the silence Thomas could not bear alone. A sudden knock jarred him from his thoughts. Jem stirred awake with a muttered curse, sitting up as the billet door cracked open to reveal a young runner from the ground crew, cap askew, cheeks flushed from the wind. "Orders for dawn, sir?" the boy said, extending a slip of paper, breath fogging in the lamp's pale light. "Patrol west of Dover, first flight. 2 sections." Thomas took the note, nodding his thanks. The runner vanished as quickly as he'd appeared, boots squelching through the puddles gathering between the huts. Jem raked a hand through his hair, blinking blearily. "Dawn again? Suppose they think Jerry's polite enough to wait for breakfast, eh?" Thomas almost laughed, but found no breath for it. He tucked the note under his kit bag and leaned back, closing his eyes against the drip of water that slipped through a crack in the ceiling to tap against the floorboards. He heard Jem settle back onto his bunk, the rustle of blankets pulled tight around tired bones. A sigh, then the soft hush of sleep reclaiming him. Harry did not stir. Rain spoke for all of them, steady as the sea's hush against the cliffs beyond the darkened field. Thomas drifted down into sleep with the weight of words never sent pressing gentle against his chest. Reminders that somewhere beyond the black canopy of cloud and searchlights, there was a world still waiting for stories unspoken to find their way home. And in that thin hour before dawn, the wind at the window seemed to whisper that perhaps, when the engines roared again and the sky claimed him anew, he might yet carry those stories safely through the coming storm. Dawn came grudgingly, dragging pale light over the sodden airfield, where puddles gleamed like shards of a broken mirror between the Spitfires lined nose to tail on the hardstand. The sky hung low and bruised with remnants of the night's storm, the channel beyond hidden under folds of mist and drizzle. Thomas stood beneath the wing of his aircraft, collar turned up against the cold spray that drifted in on a restless wind. He could taste salt on his lips and the faint sting of oil and exhaust as the ground crew coaxed each Merlin awake with soft curses and careful hands. Jem materialized at his shoulder, helmet tucked under one arm, a grin flickering behind the fog of his breath. "Suppose we'll get a clear patch soon enough. Jerry's fond of popping over when the weather's foul. Makes us squint harder." Thomas only nodded, gloved fingers brushing the Spitfire's smooth flank, as if the touch alone might bind him to its promise of return. A fitter gave him a curt nod. Fuel lines checked, guns loaded. No fresh leaks from yesterday's bullet scars. Harry approached last, boots slipping slightly in the wet grass. His young face was drawn pale by the early hour, eyes fixed not on the sky but the patch of earth beneath his feet. He carried his helmet like a fragile thing, straps trailing like the loose ends of a promise yet to be kept. "Keep tight today, Harry," Thomas said softly as the younger pilot stopped beside him. "Stay close to my starboard wing. If you lose me, cut high and loop back west. Don't try to play hero." Harry gave a small nod, his throat bobbing as he swallowed whatever reply threatened to rise. Soon they were in the cockpits, harnesses snugged down, hands flexing on the familiar curve of the stick. When the green flare burst above the dispersal hut, its fading sparkle mirrored in the wet runway below, Thomas pushed the throttle forward and felt the old, fierce pull of the Merlin gathering the earth beneath it and flinging it backward. Wheels up. Gear locked. The field dropped away, the mist parting reluctantly as they climbed into the east where the gray channel waited. The coastline behind them softened into blurred chalk cliffs and green fields stitched by hedgerows. Thomas still dreamed of at night. Today's patrol carried them south along the coastal guns, batteries hidden among dunes and cliff crests, their barrels bristling out to sea like the quills of an unseen beast. Somewhere out there, beyond the drifting veils of low cloud, the enemy's own guns returned the favor, waiting for ships that might one day come to claim those beaches. They flew in staggered pairs, 4 Spitfires strung like beads along an invisible line traced between the wind and the surf below. Beneath them, the sea shifted from gray to near black, flecked by white caps and the wake of a lone trawler hugging the coast, as if the land itself might shield it from the distant thunder of war. The radio stayed silent at first. Only the soft clicks of checks and bearings, the clipped words from Graham's lead plane calling out course corrections. Thomas stole a glance to his right and found Harry exactly where he should be this time. His Spitfire's nose locked a few yards behind Thomas's wingtip, steady enough that for a moment Thomas could almost believe the boy had flown these patrols for years. Jem's voice crackled in from the far side of the formation, low and amused. "See that trawler down there? Poor sod's probably pulling cod while we dance about like lords overhead. Wouldn't mind a piece of that catch myself. Mess hall's boiled eggs are plotting mutiny in my gut." Thomas let out a short, soundless laugh that only tightened the tension coiled in his chest. The world felt distant up here. The land and its worries, the mess hall and its cold tea. All of it narrowed to the steady thrum of the engine and the shifting patchwork of cloud and wave. Then the warning came. "Bandits, Angels 8, crossing the headland. Looks like a flight of 109s. Graham's voice, calm as ever, broke the hush like a cold blade drawn in a quiet room. Thomas shifted his grip on the stick, feeling his pulse surge through his gloves, his breath steadying into the same rhythm he'd taught himself over months of dawn briefings and sudden scrambles. They spotted them almost at once. 6 Messerschmitts slicing through a tear in the cloud, sun winking off their canopies. The 2 lines of fighters wheeled together in a wide arc, measuring distance, each pilot weighing whether this would be the day they pushed too close to the teeth of the other. The first pass was cautious. A flurry of tracer fire stitched empty air as the formations split, each side clawing for height, the Spitfires rolling hard into the sun to blind their pursuers. Thomas pressed his canopy glass close, scanning for Harry. There, still tucked behind him, wings trembling in the turbulence but holding. They looped back in. A Messerschmitt flashed across Thomas's nose, too close to think, just instinct and muscle. He squeezed the trigger, felt the wings shudder as 303 rounds ripped free, saw the flicker of strikes across the German's engine cowling before it rolled out of sight, trailing smoke but refusing to fall. A sharp cry in his headset, Jem's voice, half laughing, half shouting as he tangled with a pair trying to box him in. The sky spun with contrails and spitting guns, each burst of fire tracing an invisible story of chance and skill. Then a blur to starboard, Harry drifting wide again. A Messerschmitt turned inside him, guns flickering like a cruel grin. Thomas's breath caught. He rolled hard, engine howling, pushing the Spitfire between Harry and the German, just as tracer fire stitched the space where Harry's cockpit had been. The shock of the near collision rattled Thomas's teeth. He banked left, thumbed the trigger, and felt a surge of savage relief as his rounds ripped into the enemy's tail, sending the Messerschmitt tumbling away in a spiral of oily smoke toward the dark water below. Harry's voice came through, thin and breathless. "Thanks, Tom. I lost you. Sorry." "Don't say sorry. Get tight. Now." Thomas spat the words out between clenched teeth, eyes darting for another threat already slipping through the clouds. When the enemy broke off at last, they found themselves alone above the coastal guns, engines coughing with the sudden quiet. The sea rolled far below, indifferent, the trawler now just a smudge crawling for the safety of Dover's distant breakwater. They turned for home in silence. The air inside Thomas's canopy felt heavy, his gloves sticky with sweat, despite the chill that seeped through his flight suit. He glanced right. Harry still there, his Spitfire battered but flying. The boy's head bowed low inside the cockpit, as though bracing against a weight far heavier than the bullet scars along his wing. Back at West Langdon, the Spitfires landed in staggered pairs. Mechanics met them with quiet nods, eyes flicking from scorched cowls to the men climbing stiffly down the wing roots. No one cheered. No one ever did. But someone slapped Harry's shoulder as he stumbled to the dispersal hut, reminding him he was here, for now, with boots still on the ground. That night, Thomas sat again with pen and paper beneath the thin lamplight, rain whispering at the window. But the words would not come. Not for his mother, not for Peter, not even for the boy sleeping fitfully 2 bunks down, who now owed him his wings and perhaps his life. So Thomas only sat there, listening to the wind press at the walls, the channel murmuring somewhere beyond, patient and waiting for the next dawn's roar. When the weather finally turned, pinning even the most restless wings to the ground, the squadron was granted a brief mercy. A day's leave, though leave was a generous word for a handful of hours wandering a town that still wore its blackout curtains like mourning shawls. Thomas, Jem, and Harry found themselves walking the narrow lanes of Dover just after midday, the rain having relented to a cold wind that rattled shop signs and tugged at their greatcoats. Their boots clattered on wet cobblestones slick with the remnants of salt spray blown in from the harbor. Jem led the way, his grin back in full force now that there were rooftops instead of clouds above his head. He pointed out every narrow alley and pub as if he'd grown up here instead of Glasgow's tenements. Harry trailed close to Thomas's side, head down, hands stuffed deep in his pockets. He had barely spoken since their last mission. The fright still clung to him like oil. They stopped first at a tea shop that smelled faintly of burnt scones and damp wool coats. The windows were taped in crisscrosses to guard against blast shards, but inside the warmth felt almost defiant, a haven of chipped teacups and quiet chatter. They sat near the stove, the clatter of their mugs masking the silence that hovered between their tired words. Jem told tales of imaginary sweethearts waiting in every port from Dover to Dundee, spinning nonsense bright enough to draw a smile even from Harry. Thomas listened, stirring sugar into his tea until the spoon clinked gently against the chipped rim, the steam curling into his lashes. Outside, the war felt distant for a moment. Muffled by the clink of porcelain and the low hum of a wireless behind the counter, playing a song too cheerful to belong to these times. When the tea was gone, they stepped back into the wind, drawn by the quiet magnet of the harbor. They followed the curve of the breakwater, boots striking sparks from stray pebbles. Below, gulls wheeled and dipped, crying out over the tide that slapped the stone walls with restless hands. Jem leaned against a rusted railing, coat collar turned up to his ears. "Funny, isn't it?" he said after a while. "All this water between us and Jerry, and yet it might as well be a muddy field for all the good it does when the clouds are right." Thomas nodded, watching a minesweeper edge its way toward open water, its deck bristling with men in navy blue oilskins, faces hidden beneath helmets. He thought about how small their Spitfires would look from that deck, distant specks clawing at the gray sky, just as helpless against the vastness of the channel as the men below were against the bombers that prowled overhead. Harry lingered a few paces back, staring at the water with a far-off look that unsettled Thomas more than he cared to admit. He stepped closer, speaking low so Jem's voice wouldn't drown him out. "You're here, Harry. You flew well." Harry blinked as if surfacing from some deep place. He gave a small, shaky nod. "I keep seeing it, sir. The wing. The holes. The way the sea looked when I thought. He didn't finish. The wind took the rest of the words, spinning them out over the restless tide. Thomas put a hand on his shoulder, feeling the tremor that had settled there like an unwelcome stowaway. "You didn't fall. That's enough for today," Thomas said. It sounded small, but it was the only truth he had to give. They walked on, past warehouses with boarded windows, past fishing boats drawn up high on the shingle where rust ate quietly at their hulls. They found a pub near the docks. The King's Arms, its windows half-painted with blackout paste, the heavy door creaking like an old gate. Inside, it smelled of damp coats and coal smoke. The barmaid, sleeves rolled to her elbows, poured 3 pints without waiting to ask their names. The old wooden beams overhead were hung with bits of camouflage netting and strings of paper flags yellowed by tobacco smoke. Jem lifted his glass first. To engines that start, wings that hold, and ground crews who patch the bits that don't. Harry lifted his own glass a beat late, eyes fixed on the froth. Thomas tapped his mug against theirs, letting the cold bite of the beer clear away the taste of stale tea and fear that had lingered at the back of his throat since they'd left West Langdon. For a while, they let the low murmur of other voices fill the spaces where theirs could not go. Voices of dock workers on leave, a pair of sailors with the North Sea still clinging to their boots, a woman in a floral dress that spoke of brighter days long past. When the second round came, Harry spoke at last, not of the fight, but of home. Of a small terrace house near Sheffield, of coal fires and cracked teapots, of a sister who used to chase him down cobbled lanes with a broom when he stole the last slice of bread. Jem listened. Smile softened now, no barbs hidden in his grin for once. Thomas said little, only stored away each word like a talisman against the cold that waited when they returned to the airfield's windswept edge. As dusk crept in through the blackout blinds, they rose, boots heavy again on the wooden floorboards. Outside, the harbor lamps were already snuffed or shaded, the world folded back into the hush of wartime dark. They walked in step through the narrow lanes, each man listening for the distant thrum of bombers that might slip across the water under the cloak of night. Back at West Langdon, the billets' lamps flickered to life as they pushed through the door, damp coats dripping on the wooden floor. The wind rattled the loose panes like a soft reminder that the quiet hours had passed, that the next dawn would bring fresh orders, fresh lines traced across the map, fresh prayers whispered into flight helmets as engines roared awake. Thomas lay on his bunk long after Jem's snores rumbled through the dark, and Harry's restless tossing quieted to stillness. He pressed his palm to the pocket, where unsent letters rested against his ribs, and wondered if tomorrow he might finally find the right words to tell his mother what it truly meant to stand at the water's edge, watching the sky for shadows that never truly left. They came at night, as they so often did. The Luftwaffe's bombers, drifting across the channel beneath a moon that slipped in and out of thin, torn clouds. By day, the pilots met them high above the sea in duels that ended in flame or surrender to gravity. By night, it was the ground's turn to bear the weight of fire and steel. The warning came not as a scramble order, but as the dull moan of the air raid siren cutting through the fragile sleep that held Thomas beneath the thin wool of his blanket. He sat bolt upright as the whale rose and fell like some great beast baying at the sky. Around him, bunks rattled as men tumbled out, boots half-laced, eyes wide and unseeing in the thin glow of the billet's single bulb. Jem cursed softly, jamming his feet into boots that still carried the mud of Dover's streets. Harry, pale and silent, tugged on his greatcoat as if hoping it might shield him from more than the cold. Outside, the night was alive with the thump of hurried boots and the harsh bark of orders called through cupped hands. The squadron's Spitfires sat useless on the darkened field, canvas covers pulled tight over wings that could do nothing to chase the bombers away in darkness. Tonight, the defense belonged to the searchlights and the men who manned the guns that bristled in half circles around the airfield's ragged edge. Thomas and Jem found themselves herded to a shallow trench dug hastily beside the dispersal hut, more a suggestion of shelter than any true armor against the falling iron that might soon find them. They crouched in the loose, damp earth, the scent of churned grass and diesel thick in the cold air. Above, the first probing beams of the searchlights swept the low clouds, fingers of white stabbing upward until they found the drifting shapes of Heinkels riding the night wind. The anti-aircraft batteries opened in staggered thunderclaps, the ground trembling with each report as shells arced skyward to burst among the drifting bombers. Thomas pressed his back against the trench wall, helmet rattling each time a fresh wave of concussions rolled over them. Beside him, Jem grinned, not from any real joy, but the reckless, raw grin of a man who could not bear the thought of cowering in silence. "Suppose they fancy our teas better than London's tonight?" he shouted above the drum roll of the guns. Thomas managed a thin smile that vanished when the first dull crump of bombs landed somewhere near the southern edge of the airfield. The ground jumped, a shudder that traveled through boots, bones, and teeth all at once. Dirt rained down from the trench lip, pattering like sudden rain on tin. Harry huddled at the far end of the shallow ditch, arms wrapped around his knees, eyes wide and glassy, as he watched the sky flicker with sudden blossoms of orange and dull red. Each burst lit the underbelly of the clouds, turning them into a false dawn that revealed the bombers for a heartbeat before the dark swallowed them again. A second wave came in behind the first. Not Heinkels this time, but Dorniers slipping through gaps in the searchlight net. One caught in the beams fought to shake free, its outlines stark and unnatural above the swirling cones of white. The flak found it moments later, tearing open the fuselage in a blossom of sparks and fire. A long streak of flame trailed earthward until it vanished behind a line of distant trees. Thomas did not wonder about the men inside it. Tonight the sky belonged to no one. A fresh impact landed closer, the dispersal hut itself shuddering as a bomb found the edge of the hardstand. A low, guttural roar followed as fuel drums stacked near the maintenance sheds caught fire, painting the runway in a rippling wave of orange heat. Voices rose and fell through the din, shouted orders, calls for stretchers, the flat, hopeless silence that followed when an order came too late. Thomas felt the weight of each breath as something precious he might lose if he dared look too long at the burning edge of the field. Hours passed that felt like minutes or perhaps years. The all clear, when it came, did not come as a sudden hush, but as a slow dying of the guns, the searchlights flickering off one by one until only the wind moved across the blackened grass. They emerged from the trench stiff-limbed and blinking, boots crunching over loose earth and shards of metal that glowed faintly where they lay half buried in the soft ground. Smoke drifted from the scorched carcass of what had been the outer fuel dump. Flames still danced fitfully inside the skeleton of a maintenance shed, its roof a jagged grin of twisted iron. Thomas followed Jem toward the line of aircraft. A few Spitfires had been dragged clear by the ground crews during the raid, their wings pocked with fresh scars from stray shrapnel but otherwise intact. Others lay crumpled where the blast had caught them broadside. Torn canvas, bent spars, propellers bent at awkward angles like snapped fingers. Harry trailed behind, his eyes fixed not on the wreckage but on the sky where the bombers had come and gone like phantoms. He looked younger than ever in the flickering light of the fires, helmet tucked beneath one arm, mouth working silently at a question he seemed unable to ask. Jem clapped him on the shoulder with a rough, careless warmth. "Still here, Harry. That's the only tally that matters tonight." Harry nodded, but his gaze drifted to the blackened husk of the dispersal hut's corner. A single boot lay near the steps, half buried in soot and debris. Thomas looked away before Harry could follow his line of sight. Dawn broke eventually, pale and unwilling, spilling its thin gold across the smoldering ruin of the night's violence. The squadron's ground crews emerged from shelters with brooms and buckets, hammers and canvas patches, quiet curses, and steady hands ready to stitch the field back together before the next orders arrived. In the mess hall, tea was poured in chipped mugs by tired stewards whose eyes held the same raw edges as the pilots they served. Thomas cradled his cup, feeling its warmth seep into fingers still stained with the trench's damp earth. Jem sat beside him, hair dusty with soot, boots streaked with mud. Harry hovered at the end of the table, half listening as the older pilots swapped quiet jokes about the one bomb that missed the latrine by a single blessed yard. No one spoke of the missing, or the boot by the steps. No one asked when the next wave would come. Outside, the Spitfires stood in the dawn mist, wings patched and fuel lines checked. Soon enough, they would rise again into a sky that offered no promise, but the cold hush of the channel waiting far below. And when they did, Thomas knew the long night would ride with them, stitched into every breath, every heartbeat, every tremble in the stick that bound man and machine to the sky's restless mercy. The raids left behind more than broken roofs and scorched wings. They left questions that settled like ash in the corners of the mess hall and the hangars, questions that crawled into the back of Thomas's thoughts each time he stared across the channel's pale horizon. One gray morning, days after the longest night, the squadron received orders to escort a reconnaissance sortie deep into occupied France, a riskier push than usual, meant to probe the edges of the enemy's coastal defenses. The intelligence boys wanted pictures of new bunkers taking shape near a stretch of dunes that might one day bear the boots of an invasion force not yet spoken of aloud. The briefing was brisk. "In and out," Graham said, tapping a stub of chalk against the map pinned to the wall. "Camera bird goes in low. We cover her at height. If Jerry wants a fight, you give him a taste, but don't get clever. Our boy comes home with his plates. That's the job. Understood?" They answered with quiet nods, and the ritual clatter of helmet straps, the shuffle of maps folded and tucked into flight suits, still smelling faintly of damp wool and the bitter tang of cordite. Outside, the morning mist clung stubbornly to the field, swirling around the line of Spitfires, and the lone Mosquito prepared for the run. Slender and graceful, its belly fitted with the precious camera gear that weighed more heavily on Thomas's mind than any bomb. He climbed into his cockpit last, pulling his harness snug, gloved hand brushing the photograph of his mother still pinned near the altimeter. Jem's voice broke the hush as he settled into the next plane over. "Look sharp, Tommy. I'd rather be back for tea by supper, not floating halfway to Cherbourg." Thomas smiled, though it faded quickly behind the mask. The engines rolled awake one by one, the hush of the field giving way to the throaty chorus of merlins warming their blood for the sky's cold hunger. They rose through a gap in the drifting cloud, sunlight catching the frost on their wingtips until the world below blurred into a flat sweep of green and gray. The Mosquito slid beneath them like a shadow stitched to the sea, her twin engines humming a lower, subtler note than the Spitfire's raw snarl. Crossing the channel felt different this time. No aimless patrol or sudden scramble, but a purpose drawn tight as a wire. Thomas found himself searching the water's surface as if he might see his reflection staring back, the boy he'd once been, the pilot he'd become, the thin line between them dissolving in the roar and rush of air through the canopy. Over the French coast, the Mosquito dipped low, skimming above fields now furrowed by enemy boots and the neat, cold lines of concrete bunkers that sprouted like bitter fruit along the dunes. The radio hissed with clipped reports, bearings checked and rechecked, the squadron's arc tightening around the lone reconnaissance plane like the ribs of a fragile cage. Then came the flicker of enemy wings. Messerschmitts, half a dozen or more, sweeping in from the south, where the morning sun turned them to silver ghosts. They closed fast, their line breaking apart as they rolled into the attack. Graham's voice cut in, iron wrapped in calm. "Tally-ho, lads. Hold the line. Mosquito stays clear." The Spitfires peeled away in pairs, each pilot choosing an angle to draw the Germans wide. Thomas fell in behind Jem, throttling up as tracers cracked the sky around them. He caught the glint of a Messerschmitt's canopy, the flicker of its guns as it spat rounds that punched holes in the cold wind inches from his wing. He rolled right, nose dipping, thumb pressed firm on the trigger. The Spitfire shuddered as rounds tore free, the Messerschmitt flaring into his gun sight for a heartbeat, too quick. The German broke high and away, dragging Thomas into a shallow climb that strained the engine to its edge. The radio flared with scattered voices. Harry's breathless shout, Jem's sharp laugh turned ragged as he slipped beneath a pair trying to box him in. Thomas checked left, then right, searching for the mosquito. Still there, skimming the dunes, camera plates clicking, oblivious to the fight overhead. A Messerschmitt cut across Thomas's tail, guns biting deep into his port wing. He felt the Spitfire buck, heard the dull thud of rounds carving through metal too close to the cockpit. He kicked hard on the rudder, rolling left until the nose dropped into a punishing dive. Wind howled in his ears as the altimeter spun. The sea flashed beneath him, a thin promise of safety if only he could level out in time. He eased the stick back, teeth clenched against the weight pressing him deep into the seat. The Spitfire trembled, the wounded wing groaning but holding. He climbed again, lungs burning, eyes searching the sky until they found the mosquito banking west, its work done. The Messerschmitts broke off, unwilling to follow too far into the Spitfire's teeth once their prey slipped out of reach. They turned for home in a loose, ragged line. Jem's voice cut through the crackle. All plates accounted for? Good enough. Let's leave Jerry counting his lucky stars. Crossing the channel, the mosquito limped slightly behind them, a thin trail of oil seeping from a nicked engine cowling. But it stayed aloft, camera belly intact, each frame of exposed film worth more than a dozen victories in the sky. When they landed at West Langdon, ground crews swarmed the reconnaissance plane first, precious canisters lifted out like relics from a holy shrine. Thomas climbed down his wing route, boots touching mud that felt suddenly more real than the cold air above. Jem dropped beside him, helmet under one arm, grin tired but alive. "No tea for supper," he said with a shrug, "but we'll settle for the mess stew. Not much else to settle for these days, eh?" Thomas only nodded, glancing back at the mosquito where the camera crew huddled with an intelligence officer, already unfolding fresh maps across its wing. He turned then to the channel, just visible as a dull gleam beyond the edge of the field, the gray ribbon that always waited, always demanded its due. Above it, the sky still looked wide enough to hold every secret, every prayer, every glance over the shoulder at an enemy who stared back with the same young eyes and the same dreams, drawn to the same thin edge between falling and flying. Even with the channel crossed safely again, the airfield felt different that evening. The sort of difference that settled in men's bones long before they could name it aloud. The mess hall was alive with the usual hum of spoons, tapping tin mugs, and tired laughter echoing off low timber beams. But beneath it all lay a hush that pressed at the edges of every voice. The mosquito's plates had gone straight into a lorry that sped off into the dusk. Guarded by two men in greatcoats who did not remove their gloves, their expressions locked in the same iron calm that Flight Lieutenant Graham wore on his worst days. The photographs they carried would decide something far beyond the reach of the pilot's wings. New raids, new maps drawn in secret rooms, new plans that might send ships back across the channel one day for good. Thomas sat with Jem and Harry at a table pushed near the stove's flickering warmth. Outside the windows, blackout curtains fluttered with each cold draft that slipped through the thin walls. Jem picked at a tin of corned beef, as though it were a puzzle to be solved rather than a meal to be eaten. Harry sat hunched, boots planted square on the wooden floor, hands folded tight around a mug that had long since gone cold. A pair of older pilots traded stories near the far end of the room, their laughter forced but grateful, rolling over the scrape of chairs and the steady tap of rain against the panes. Above them, the beams creaked as the wind rattled the roof, the same wind that carried the distant hum of the channel and the soft, ever-present promise that the next dawn might come sooner than sleep would allow. Thomas turned the edge of his fork through his stew, more bone than broth tonight. He caught Harry's eyes flicking to the empty seat at the next table. The one that had belonged to a pilot named Miles. Miles, who'd arrived 2 weeks ago, fresh-faced and eager, his name stitched on a kit bag, so knew the canvas still smelled of the factory. Miles, who'd clipped a wing over Dieppe, forced down near the dunes where the mosquito had flown its photographs that morning. No word yet. No body, no crash site, no news. Just an empty chair that no one touched, though the stewards still scrubbed its table each evening, as if he might slip in again at any moment. Boots dripping channel spray, laughter trailing behind like a gull's cry. Jem caught Thomas's glance, his grin twisting sharp as flack. "Don't stare, Tommy. It's bad luck to watch the ghosts before they've decided they're ghosts for good." Harry flinched at that, but Jem's tone softened before the younger man could drift too far into the dark. He nudged Harry's mug closer to the stove. "Best drink it before it grows teeth, lad. Cold tea's more dangerous than any Messerschmitt." Harry managed a thin smile, but didn't answer. His mind, Thomas knew, was miles east, somewhere over dunes and cold surf, imagining what it would feel like to drift down behind enemy lines. A silk canopy overhead, boots squelching into sand while searchlights prowled for the smallest slip of movement. When the meal was done, they drifted back to the billets in twos and threes, boots tapping puddles that had gathered in the ruts between the hangars. The air smelled of wet grass and the faint sting of spent fuel. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, a dog barked once, sharp and unanswered. Inside the billet, the hush deepened. Jem fell onto his bunk with a low groan, boots kicked aside at last, his hands pillowing the back of his head. Harry sat cross-legged on his blanket, kit bag open at his feet, fingers tracing the worn edge of a folded letter that he did not read aloud. Thomas moved to the small shelf near his bunk, running his thumb across the paper tucked behind his mother's photograph. Letters never sent. Still waiting for a day when he might find the courage or foolishness to drop them in the outgoing sack. He unfolded one. The note meant for Peter, who sat far north along some bleak coastal watchtower, listening for engines that might slip beneath the radar's tired sweep. He read the words he already knew by heart. The lines where he'd tried to confess how fear made his breath catch at dawn, how the channel's wide hush felt heavier than the roar of the Merlin when it swallowed the dead on bad days. He wondered if Peter would understand the empty chair better than the men who filled the bunks now. New faces who still believed in warm beds back home. In letters answered. In medals pinned to clean dress uniforms at some parade that might never come. He slipped the letter back behind the photo, letting his palm rest against the frame as though it might anchor him to Linton's hedgerows and the soft hum of his mother's voice when she sang over her mending. Jem's breathing turned slow, a gentle rasp that filled the billet's hush. Harry lay down last, boots still on, eyes fixed on the ceiling beams as if he could read some promise written there by men braver than the ones who'd gone before. The wind rattled the windows until Thomas closed his eyes, the memory of the day's dogfight flickering behind them. The Messerschmitt rolling into the sun, the mosquito's silver belly vanishing behind drifting cloud, the empty sea waiting below like an open palm. Somewhere beyond the bunkhouse walls, ground crews worked by lantern light, patching holes, hammering spars straight, swabbing oil from engines that would wake hungry again come dawn. The channel sighed in the dark, a restless hush carrying the ghost of every man whose boots never found dry land again. Thomas drifted into sleep with the echo of Miles's laugh haunting the corners of the billet, the soft scrape of a chair no longer pulled back from the table, a promise half kept between the wind and the waves. And when morning came, as it always did, he knew they would rise once more to meet the sky that never promised to keep them, yet always demanded they trust it just the same. Before the sun rose, the clatter of wrenches and the murmur of quiet curses drifted through the thin walls of the billet. Thomas stirred at the sound, long before the runner knocked to rouse the pilots for the day's orders. He lay still for a moment, listening to the rhythm of hammers tapping a stubborn cowling back into shape, the muted rumble of a Merlin engine being coaxed into breath like a stubborn old man refusing to leave his bed. When he stepped out into the raw blue dawn, the airfield glowed faintly with the scatter of lanterns bobbing in the pre-dawn mist. Men in oil-stained coveralls moved like shadows between the Spitfires, hands black with grease and knuckles raw from cold metal and salt wind. They spoke little, except to swear at a stuck bolt or mutter a quick joke that faded as quickly as it rose. Thomas found Jem already at the line, leaning against his aircraft with a cigarette perched at the corner of his grin. Beside him, old Merton, the ground crew's senior mechanic, hunched over the port wing, fingers probing the fabric skin where a bullet had stitched a neat line during yesterday's sortie. "Morning, Tommy," Jem called, flicking ash into the wet grass. "Merton here says my girl's ready to fly, but I say she just likes him better than me. He sweet-talks her at night." Merton barked a dry laugh without lifting his eyes from his work. "She listens, that's all. Not like you lot, pushing her past redline every chance you get." He straightened then, rolling his stiff shoulders beneath a threadbare coat, its collar rimmed with old oil stains. His eyes, when they met Thomas's, were small and sharp, set deep in a face mapped with lines from too many cold dawns and sleepless nights under the engine's restless growl. "You look after her, sir," Merton said, his voice flat but edged with something like a father's worry. "She'll bring you home if you let her. But she's no use if you won't listen when she talks." Thomas smiled faintly. "I try." "I try harder," Merton said. He reached out then, a grease-darkened palm laid flat against the metal skin just behind the engine cowling. His lips moved silently, not a prayer in any church's keeping, but the old, private litany of a man who believed in rivets and oil more than saints. Thomas wondered, not for the first time, how many men Merton had sent into the sky on wings held together by nothing but stubbornness, spit, and the steady hope that today the machine would forgive the pilot's mistakes. Further down the line, Harry stood beside his Spitfire, hands buried deep in his pockets as he watched a pair of riggers fit a fresh propeller to replace the one chewed by shrapnel 2 sorties ago. He caught Thomas's eye and gave a small, uncertain nod, the kind that never quite reached the shoulders. Graham's voice snapped them all back to the cold hush of the moment. The flight lieutenant strode the line with his clipboard, boots crunching frost from the grass, eyes flicking from pilot to mechanic and back again. He rattled off the day's plan: patrol east toward the Belgian coast, probing for a flight of bombers the intel boys said might slip back home under the cover of broken clouds. "Same drill as always," he said, tone clipped, eyes shadowed by the brim of his cap. "Tight formation, don't chase a lone kite too far east. If you lose your wingman, you find the sun and you find your way home." He paused at Harry's plane, eyes lingering on the raw edges of the new propeller. A glance passed between him and the young pilot, words unsaid but understood by both. Harry nodded stiffly, helmet cradled against his chest like a promise he hadn't yet decided to keep. Engines turned over in staggered growls, the hush of the field dissolving under the roll and thrum of merlins waking to their familiar song. Merton stepped back from Jem's plane, wiping his palms on a rag blackened beyond saving. Thomas watched him touch the nose of each Spitfire in turn, a blessing disguised as habit, an old man's prayer to steel and wind. Thomas hauled himself into the cockpit, the leather harness biting cold against his shoulders. He flicked through the checklist by rote, magnetos, fuel taps, trim, but his mind lingered on Merton's rough hand pressed flat to the wing, the quiet murmur of words that would never see daylight. The green flare rose from the tower. Throttles opened. Wheels bumped and thumped over the rutted strip until the horizon tilted, the airfield falling away beneath the steady lift of wings that were, for the moment, whole and willing. At altitude, the sky unfolded in ragged seams of silver cloud and pale sun. The channel glittered beneath them, wide and indifferent, its hush lost beneath the engine's steady roar. Thomas fell in on Jem's port side, Harry tucked behind him like a younger brother shadowing astride half a size too long. They crossed the coast where the dunes rose like broken teeth from the surf, the low cliffs stained gray by winter storms. Overhead, contrails marked the place where cold air met hot exhaust, white stitches unraveling behind wings that might yet hold or fail. The enemy did not come at first. They flew the patrol line twice, scanning the horizon for shapes that never resolved. Then, as the sun slipped west behind a drift of cloud, the Messerschmitts emerged. Black flecks at first, then the glint of canopies catching late light, the sudden shimmer of guns spitting tracer into the frozen air. Thomas rolled left into the turn, feeling the stick pulse under his gloves. Jem's voice snapped in his headset, a laugh sharp enough to bite through fear. "They're keen today. Watch my 6, Tommy." The sky fractured into spirals of fire and metal. Harry's voice came through, thin but there. "Staying with you, sir. Still with you." Thomas looped behind a Messerschmitt that ducked beneath Jem's burst, guns rattling through his wings until the canopy rattled with the stutter of recoil. Smoke feathered from the German's tail, a brief soft bloom that spun away in the slipstream. A shout in his ear, "On your 9, Tommy! Break! Break now!" He jerked the stick, felt the wing groan, the world rolling over until the channel flashed above him, then below. The Merlin roared its anger into his bones. A heartbeat later, the tracer line tore through where he'd been. When they turned for home, the enemy scattered back into the east, shadows slipping into the dusk. The Spitfires limped westward, holes stitched along wingtips and cowls, engines wheezing but alive. At West Langdon, Merton waited at the hardstand, sleeves rolled to his elbows despite the cold. He watched Thomas climb down, his eyes flicking over the punctures in the wing, the grime on the pilot's gloves. "Listen to her, did you?" Merton asked. Thomas nodded. "I did." Merton only grunted, his palm finding the warm metal just behind the exhaust stack, lips moving again in that same soft hush that never asked for thanks. In the fading light, the last warmth of the Merlin ticked through the Spitfire's bones, each pop of cooling metal a quiet echo of a prayer that had, for one more day, been heard. There was a small hut near the western fence of West Langdon Airfield, set slightly apart from the clatter of hangars and the low, constant grumble of trucks that ferried parts and fuel between the dispersal bays. In daylight, few pilots paid it much mind. A squat wooden building with a door that never quite shut against the wind, its chimney breathing a thin line of smoke on calm evenings. Inside was the chaplain, Reverend Markham, though no one called him Reverend unless they were fresh from training and still believed they might sit through a sermon without shifting in their boots. To the squadron, he was simply Padre, a spare man with a soft Yorkshire burr and a pair of cracked glasses that forever slid down his nose when he read from his thin book of prayers. Thomas found himself there one evening after a sortie that left more questions than relief. The patrol had come back whole in the strictest sense, no one missing, no planes lost outright. But Harry had landed pale and silent, his hands trembling so badly he'd struggled with his harness until Thomas helped him unbuckle it on the wing route. Jem had walked them both back across the muddy field, his grin forced, words bright and sharp as tacks to hide the worry simmering beneath. When Harry turned into the billet with that hollow look in his eyes, Thomas lingered outside, the cold dusk pinching at his cheeks. He saw the thin plume of smoke from Markham's chimney, and on impulse, drifted toward it. Inside, the hut smelled of stale candles and the faint, bitter edge of coal smoke. A kettle rattled gently on a small iron stove in the corner. The Padre looked up from a clutter of letters spread across his battered desk, his spectacles halfway down his nose as usual. "Flight Lieutenant Whitaker," he said, his smile a warm line in his thin face. "Or are you still just Thomas here?" Thomas hesitated, hand resting on the doorframe. "Just Thomas tonight, sir." Markham's smile widened slightly. "Then come in, Thomas. Mind your head on that beam. The hut was made for shorter souls." Thomas ducked inside and let the door settle shut against the wind's restless rattle. The Padre gestured him to a chair opposite the desk, sweeping aside a stack of envelopes with names Thomas recognized. Names that once belonged to boots and bunk beds, now pinned to lines written in careful apologetic ink. "Tea's gone weak, but it's hot enough to fool the bones," Markham said, pouring 2 chipped mugs and pushing one across the desk. "What brings you to my grand cathedral tonight?" Thomas watched the steam curl above his mug. For a while, he did not answer. He listened instead to the faint rumble of the airfield beyond the thin walls, a lorry shifting gears, the echo of a wrench striking a tool tray, the distant bark of a sergeant's orders flung into the dusk. "I'm not sure," he said at last, his voice so low it almost vanished in the hush. "Maybe. I don't know if it's for me. The prayers, I mean." Markham settled back, his thin fingers folding neatly around his own mug. "Well, that's the nice thing about prayers, Thomas. They're rather like engines. They don't much care who's holding the stick, so long as they're used with a little care." Thomas huffed a quiet laugh through his nose. "Do they work?" Markham shrugged, his eyes drifting to the guttered candle flickering beside a battered tin cross on the shelf above the stove. "Depends on what you expect. They won't patch your wings for you. Merton's better at that. They won't outfly a Messerschmitt either. but they have a knack for holding a man's fear steady for a moment or two. And some nights, that's more than enough. Thomas turned the mug slowly in his hands. Harry nearly went in today. He froze, just for a second. I saw it in his eyes. Same look Alfie had. Miles too, before he didn't come back. The Padre said nothing for a moment. He reached up and pinched the guttering wick, snuffing the candle with a soft twist of his fingers before relighting it from a match struck against his boot heel. Do you know why I keep that? He asked, nodding at the flame. Thomas shook his head. It's not the candle, really, Markham said, voice softer now, the Yorkshire edges of his words smoothing out like stones under a river. It's the promise behind it. I light it for the boys who come in here asking how to say goodbye to fear, and for the ones who never ask at all. Thomas stared at the little flame, its flicker catching in the dusty glass of the Padre's spectacles. Do you think they know? He asked after a while. The ones who go in? Do you think they're afraid? Markham's smile was a line caught halfway between sadness and something steadier. Of course they're afraid, Thomas. Even the bravest are. That's the trick of courage. It only counts if it lives beside fear. And if you're asking, it means you still have yours tucked close. That's no small thing. A gust rattled the window, carrying with it the distant pulse of an engine winding down for the night. Thomas felt the warmth of the tea seep into his chest, a fragile comfort against the cold that waited beyond the hut's thin walls. When he rose to leave, Markham didn't offer a prayer or a sermon. He only reached out and pressed a small box of matches into Thomas's palm. For your billet, he said with a faint, conspiratorial wink. Next time the ghosts get too loud. Thomas tucked it into his pocket beside the folded letters he still couldn't send. He stepped out into the wind again, boots crunching over frost-bitten grass, the dark wide and cold above him. In the billet, Harry slept at last, breath slow, boots still half-laced as if he might need to run at a moment's notice. Jem dozed too, one arm flung over his face to hide dreams he never spoke aloud. Thomas sat by the small shelf, struck one match, and lit a candle stub he found beside a chipped tin mug. The tiny flame wavered in the draft, catching the edge of his mother's photograph and the unsent letters stacked neatly behind it. He watched it for a long time, a frail, flickering promise in a world that asked men to fly each dawn into a sky that kept its secrets close. The dawn came with a sky scraped raw by wind. Over the channel, clouds dragged like torn linen, the sun fighting to break through, but never quite winning. At West Langdon, the mess hall was alive with the clink of mugs and the scrape of cutlery, yet every man in uniform kept an ear tilted toward the doorway, listening for the runner who would come with the day's orders. When the knock came, it carried with it the hush of bad news unspoken. The squadron assembled by the dispersal hut, where Graham stood waiting, greatcoat buttoned to his throat against the biting gusts that whipped across the airfield. His clipboard glinted dull in the half-light as he spoke. A convoy's gone adrift, he said, his voice cutting clean through the wind. Merchantmen and an old destroyer. They strayed too far west of Dover last night, caught by E-boats. We've got reports of Heinkel's moving in to finish what the torpedoes didn't. Thomas felt the cold dig deeper into his gloves. He thought of the fishing boats they'd glimpsed on clear days, sails white as gulls, of the slow gray silhouettes of merchant ships that crawled along the coastal lanes like beetles too stubborn to hide. He thought of fathers and sons on cold steel decks, boots braced against the channel's restless sway. You'll go up. Sweep the lanes clear. Give the convoy room to limp home, Graham continued. It'll be low. It'll be messy. Keep your eyes sharp and your fuel tighter. If you have to bail, you'll be swimming before the rescue boys find you. Stay tight. Bring each other back. Jem shot Thomas a sidelong grin that did not reach the corners of his eyes. A swim, eh? Hope you packed your trunks, Tommy, Thomas answered with a thin breath of a smile. Harry shifted behind them, helmet in hand, knuckles white against the battered leather. Soon the Spitfires sat nose to wind on the battered strip, wings twitching in the restless breeze like birds impatient to leap. Mechanics knelt beneath engine cowlings one last time, checking plugs, tightening bolts that might hold life together for another hour. Merton moved from plane to plane with the quiet authority of a man who spoke to engines as if they were children in need of a gentle promise. When Thomas climbed into his cockpit, Merton's hand found the leading edge of the wing, palm pressed flat as though he might steady both man and machine with a single wordless blessing. The squadron rose as one into the morning gray. The land fell behind, the cliffs a thin line smeared by distance and mist. Below, the channel rolled restless and dark, flecked with the white foam of waves that paid no mind to men who drifted above them in fragile metal skins. They found the convoy limping west, a ragged chain of hulls spread wide against the horizon's bruise. Black smoke drifted from the stern of a freighter already half lowered into the sea's grasp. A destroyer veered close, her deck bristling with men waving up at the fighters who circled like guardian hawks above wounded prey. Thomas counted the shapes. 5 merchantmen, the destroyer, 1 smaller trawler, towing a crippled vessel that left an oil smear behind it like a torn flag. He tightened his grip on the stick, scanning the empty sky for the shadows he knew would come. They did. Not from the coast, but from a ragged hole in the clouds that split the sun's thin gleam into shards of silver and gray. Heinkels. Low and heavy, crossing in slow, deliberate lines, bomb doors yawning wide like jaws waiting to feed. Bandits, 11 o'clock low. Coming for the lead freighter. Jem's voice snapped through the static. Tally-ho, Tommy. Let's not keep 'em waiting. The squadron split apart and dove, wings screaming as the air pulled at every rivet and spar. Thomas pressed the throttle open, felt the Merlin roar its defiance. Tracer fire laced the sky, bright threads weaving between drifting bursts of flak thrown up by the convoy's deck guns. A Heinkel loomed ahead. Slow, cumbersome, its belly split wide to spill bombs toward the crippled hull below. Thomas squeezed the trigger, the stick shuddering as rounds spat through the wings. He saw the strike spark along the Heinkel's fuselage, the sudden plume of smoke that flowered behind its engines. He rolled beneath its belly, the sea flashing close enough to taste the salt in his mouth. A voice cut in. Harry's, tight and thin. On your 6, sir. Messerschmitts. 2, maybe 3. Thomas pulled hard into the climb, the Merlin protesting with a growl that rattled his teeth. He felt the tracers whip past the canopy, sharp zips of death he did not have time to fear. Jem dropped in, guns chattering, his laughter cutting the static like a blade. One's off you, Tommy! Get the other! Get him now! The sky blurred, the channel spinning past in cold flickers of gray and white. Thomas rolled left, found the Messerschmitt's flank, and squeezed the trigger until the world shrank to the judder of recoil and the smell of cordite filling his mask. A wing tore loose, the German fighter veering down in a helpless spiral that ended in a black splash far below. Thomas steadied his Spitfire, breath burning in his lungs, the engine's hum now a living thing beneath his bones. Above the convoy, the bombers pulled away, scattered by the Spitfires that wove among them like angry swallows. One freighter burned but still crawled westward, her wake a bright wounded scar across the restless water. When the last enemy slipped eastward for home, the squadron turned for land. Below, sailors waved small shapes, caps, rags, desperate signals of thanks that vanished in the slipstream as the fighters climbed for the coast. They crossed the cliffs in tight formation, the channel's hush replaced by the low murmur of their engines easing back toward the waiting field. The Spitfires landed one by one, wheels biting into soft ruts scarred by last week's rain. On the hard stand, Thomas climbed down to find Merton waiting, rags slung over one shoulder, the same quiet question in his eyes. Thomas answered it with a nod. Merton pressed his hand to the warm nose of the Spitfire, lips moving with that same old litany that asked nothing but promised everything. Harry staggered in last, boots slipping in the wet grass. He grinned then, a small, worn grin, but true this time, and clapped Thomas on the shoulder as they walked back toward the dispersal hut. Behind them, the channel lay wide and endless, its waves rolling on toward ships yet unseen and men yet uncounted, a promise and a threat in the same breath. And above it all, the sky waited, still hungry, still indifferent, still the only place Thomas knew he belonged, for all it might yet take from him. The channel's storm broke 2 nights later, a wind that howled through the thin seams of the billet walls, rattled the loose panes of glass, and left the Spitfires shivering under tarpaulins pinned down with sandbags and hope. The ground turned to mud so thick that boots vanished ankle-deep along the walk to the dispersal hut. Yet the war did not wait for clearer skies. When the first dawn after the storm lifted the worst of the gale, orders came quick and cold. Another raid across the coast, this time to strafe a rail yard north of Calais. Intelligence said trains loaded with munitions sat waiting for the cover of darkness to slip them inland. If they could be torn open by daylight, some boy in a trench might have one less shell screaming overhead tomorrow. At briefing, Graham's voice carved through the weary hush. Hit the tracks. Take out the rolling stock. Keep your speed. They've sighted new flak guns there. Get in, break it, and get home. Thomas caught Harry's eye across the table, the younger pilot's fingers drumming on his folded map, a nervous staccato he didn't seem to notice. Jem sat at Thomas's side, humming a tune under his breath, as if daring the tension to find a hold in his chest. They climbed out of the mud in pairs, wheels clawing at the waterlogged strip, until the Spitfires lifted free into a sky that still tasted of salt and rain. Below them, the channel's surface heaved in slow gray swells, whitecaps cresting like restless ghosts. They crossed the French coast just above the broken seam of dunes that Thomas had come to know almost as well as the hedgerows of Linton by the Mere. His hands moved without thought, the Merlin's vibrations running up his arms like an old song that no longer surprised him. Ahead, the rail line cut a dark scar through damp fields patched with hedges and the thin winter skeletons of poplars. The yard emerged like a sore tooth in the mouth of the village, tracks gleaming wet, lines of boxcars and flatbeds bristling with crates covered by tarpaulins too thin to fool an eye that had learned to pick out secrets at speed. Graham's clipped order crackled in Thomas's headset. All sections, make your pass. Watch the flak. Tally-ho. They broke from the high arc into a shallow dive, wings folding into the rush that turned the world into a blur of gray sky and green earth stitched together by the sudden blink of muzzle flashes. Thomas felt the sting of the wind clawing at his helmet, the nose of the Spitfire trembling as he squeezed the trigger. Bullets raked the length of a boxcar, sparks and splinters flaring behind his guns. A burst of black smoke bloomed near his starboard wing, the flak gunners waking fully to their work. Another shell burst ahead, shards of steel cracking past his canopy like hail on glass. He banked hard left, eyes flicking over his shoulder in a frantic check for Harry's silhouette. There. The younger pilot tucked just behind, holding his line with a dogged determination that made Thomas's chest tighten with something like pride and fear tangled into one. Then came the sudden, sickening bloom of fire. A boxcar on the next track erupted, the blast punching through the dawn with a roar that Thomas felt rather than heard. A shockwave struck the Spitfire's belly, jolting him up in the seat as a second explosion snapped a plume of flame across the tracks. Through the rising smoke, he glimpsed Jem's Spitfire rolling low, guns stitching another line of ruin along the siding. Over the radio came a barked laugh. "Nice fireworks, Tommy. Don't stay for the encore." And then the sky fell apart. A flak shell burst close, too close. Thomas felt the shudder before he saw the holes rip through the port wing. The stick jolted against his glove, the Spitfire lurching sideways as if some invisible hand had shoved it from behind. "You're venting, Tommy. You're venting." Jem's voice cut through, ragged and urgent. "Get her up, lad. Climb! Climb now!" Thomas gritted his teeth, fighting the shudder that ran through the airframe. Smoke curled across the canopy glass, a faint, acrid taste that made his throat burn. He hauled the nose up, the Merlin coughing, sputtering, then catching again with a desperate growl. He leveled out just above the rooftops of the village, the rail yard shrinking behind him in a haze of flame and spiraling smoke. Ahead, the fields opened like a promise of escape if only the wounded wing would hold. In his mirror, Harry's Spitfire stayed close, too close, the boy's canopy barely a wing's breadth from his tail. Through the slipstream came Harry's voice, quiet but steady. "Still with you, sir. Still with you." Thomas did not trust himself to answer. He set his jaw, eyes locked on the coastline, flickering gray in the far distance. The channel, the only barrier between him and the long slide into the sea of flame behind him. They crossed the dunes together, engines rattling in strained chorus. Jem's voice drifted back into the headset, softer now, the wild edge gone. "Nearly there, Tommy. Nearly there, lad." Below, the airfield waited like a patch of hope sewn onto the wet cloth of the land. Thomas dropped the wheels, felt the battered wing sag as if begging him not to ask too much more. The landing was no landing at all, more a desperate slide into the mud, the wheels biting soft ground before the port wing dipped, caught, and cracked. The Spitfire lurched sideways, a protest of tortured metal as the fuselage skidded to a halt just shy of the perimeter fence. Silence followed. The soft hiss of the Merlin dying, the tick of hot metal cooling in the rain. Through the canopy glass smeared with mud, Thomas saw Merton running, oil rag flapping from his pocket, boots churning up sprays of wet earth. When they hauled him out, Thomas's knees nearly buckled. He leaned against the broken wing, one hand pressed flat to its dented skin like a promise that somehow, even in ruin, it had carried him home. Behind him, Harry's boots squelched in the mud. The young pilot's eyes were wide, pupils pinpricks of fear still raw beneath the sheen of rain. "You stayed with me," Thomas said, voice rasping through a throat tight with cold and smoke. Harry's grin flickered in the gray dawn, small, fragile, but real. "You'd have done the same." Merton's hand found the wing beside Thomas's palm, grease and rain mingling in the seams of battered metal. "Aye," the old mechanic murmured, his voice rough but certain. "She talked to you, didn't she, lad? And you listened?" Thomas nodded, the roar of the channel lost behind the hush of rain pattering on broken wings that, for one more day, had held. 2 days passed before the mechanics coaxed the worst of the storm from Thomas's battered Spitfire. The wing was patched, spars straightened under Merton's watchful eye, fabric replaced where shrapnel had torn through like claws. Still, Thomas knew she would never fly quite the same again, as if the engine, too, remembered how close it had come to dying over the rails of Calais. In those days, the airfield settled into a hush that felt more like held breath than rest. The Channel storms swept through again and again, pinning the squadron to the muddy runways, winds too fierce for safe takeoffs. Engines turned over in half-hearted growls each morning, only to be silenced again by Graham's flat voice from the dispersal hut. "Stand down. Keep the fuel dry." So the men drifted through the hours in slow rituals. Jem filled the billet with the shuffle of cards and old jokes that made Harry laugh too loudly at nothing at all. Some pilots scribbled letters that would find their way home in battered mail sacks, folded so many times the creases seemed part of the paper's grain. A few slipped away to the little hut by the western fence, where Reverend Markham kept the kettle warm and the candle lit whether they asked for prayers or not. Thomas walked the line of Spitfires when the rain allowed, boots squelching in the ruts left by maintenance lorries. He ran his palm along each patched wing, fingers brushing rivets that held together more than just metal and canvas. They held together the promise that tomorrow, if the sky cleared, they would lift him from the mud again. Merton caught him one afternoon, leaning into the cowling of the same battered Spitfire Thomas had limped home in. The old mechanic's cap dripped rain down his collar, but he barely seemed to notice as he cradled a spanner in one scarred hand. "Looking for cracks we missed?" he asked, voice wrapped in the rasp of a lifetime spent shouting above roaring engines. "Just seeing if she forgives me," Thomas answered, half smiling. Merton snorted, tightening a bolt with a twist of his wrist. "She doesn't hold grudges. It's the wind that remembers, lad. The sky keeps the stories." He stepped back then, rapped his knuckles against the wing's leading edge with something like affection. "She'll fly again. And so will you, though I'd patch the holes in your ribs same as I did these, if you'd let me." Thomas only nodded, his eyes drifting to where Harry's Spitfire sat further down the line, the boy's boots just visible beneath its belly, the toes tapping a soft rhythm on the mud as he traced the outline of fresh bullet patches with his fingertips. That night, the rain slackened enough for the men to wander from the billet toward the mess hall. Jem led the way, boots splashing through puddles that mirrored the soft lantern light spilling from the windows. Inside, they found a warmth that felt more honest than the stale coal smoke that clung to the walls. The tables hummed with low chatter, cups of thin tea balanced between elbows propped on worn wood. Harry sat close to Thomas this time, shoulders not quite so tight, his grin flickering in and out as Jem spun another story about a sergeant's run-in with a stubborn goat somewhere back in training. The tale was nonsense, the sort that carried no truth but offered just enough laughter to push the cold back a few inches from their chests. When the meal was done, Thomas lingered at the mess door. He caught sight of Reverend Markham at a corner table, sleeves rolled to his elbows. Ink smudged across his cuffs as he folded a letter with careful hands. Their eyes met for a moment, and the padre dipped his head slightly. The same small nod he gave the dying candle each night when the last of its wax pooled in the brass holder by his stove. Outside, the wind smelled of salt and the hush of the channel just beyond the dunes. Thomas paused beside the dispersal hut where a single lantern glowed within. Inside, Graham sat hunched over the big wall map, a fresh line drawn across the coast, red pins marking places that tomorrow might wake to the thunder of Spitfires overhead. Thomas knew without asking that the storm's reprieve would not last forever. He felt it in the steady hush of the wet earth beneath his boots, in the ragged edges of the wind that pressed at the canvas wings under their tarpaulins. The sky would open again soon, and when it did, it would not do so gently. He found himself drifting back to the billet last. Inside, Jem lay sprawled across his bunk, one boot on, one boot off, mouth half open in the careless sprawl of a man who burned through his waking hours too bright to fear the dark. Harry sat cross-legged on his own bunk, fingers working a pencil stub over a scrap of envelope, his lips moving as he mouthed words he would likely never send. Thomas slipped his hand into his tunic pocket and felt the familiar press of the matches Markham had given him. He struck one, the flare of sulfur sharp in the small room, then bent it to the candle he'd kept on the shelf above his kit bag. The flame caught, steady this time, its glow brushing the photograph of his mother, the folded letters tucked behind it like secrets kept safe for another day. He sat on the edge of his bunk, boots still muddy, shoulders bowed under the hush that settled when the wind paused between gusts. Outside, the channel whispered against the cliffs. Somewhere beyond that wide gray hush, enemy pilots waited for the same break in the clouds. The same call to scramble, the same chance to write their names on the sky or into the sea below. Thomas closed his eyes, felt the warmth of the candle press soft against his face, and breathed in the hush like a promise that the waiting would end soon enough. And when it did, they would rise again on wings patched and trembling, but still willing to lift them into whatever dawn waited on the far side of the storm. At first light, the rain held its breath, a thin pause in weeks of wind and water. Over West Langdon, the clouds broke just enough to show a slice of pale sky, as if dawn itself had stepped carefully over the airfield, testing whether the waiting had worn the men too thin to rise again. They were ready long before the runner knocked at the billet door. Boots found their places on cold floors, buckles snapped shut, helmets checked and rechecked by hands that moved through the ritual like priests at some private altar. Jem swung his legs off his bunk with a grunt and gave Harry's shoulder a soft shove. "Time to stop pretending you're asleep, lad. The sky's come calling." Harry's eyes fluttered open. He looked younger than ever in that hush, a boy in a man's flight suit, lashes dark against skin too pale for the morning's promise. But when he swung his boots to the floor and caught Thomas's eye, there was a steadiness there that had not been so clear weeks ago. They gathered at the dispersal hut in a silence that needed no words. Graham stood waiting, greatcoat pulled tight, his eyes on the map pinned to the wall beside him. New lines were drawn, sweeping arcs of pencil that crossed the channel's thin waste and looped back in broad, merciless sweeps over occupied coastline. "Raid on Boulogne docks," Graham said, voice even, unyielding. "Our bombers will run her in low and fast. We're cover. Keep the flak off their backs. Keep the fighters off their tails. This one counts, so we do it clean and we do it quick." He paused, looking from face to face. These men he had watched arrive one by one with fresh creases in their uniforms and wide eyes that still believed the earth was the safer place to stand. Some were gone now, names inked on letters Markham folded by candlelight. Some stood here still, older in the eyes than the days behind them could explain. "You've done this before," Graham said, softer now. "You'll do it again. Come home straight. That's all." Out on the strip, Merton and the ground crew had worked through the last hours of dark, spanners and rags whispering over metal that groaned its protests and offered its promise all at once. Thomas found his Spitfire waiting. patched seams along the port wing where shrapnel had tried to tear the heart from her days ago. She gleamed dull under the thin dawn, her nose turned into the hush of the wind that carried the salt of the channel in its breath. Merton touched his knuckles to the leading edge as Thomas climbed up, his whisper half swallowed by the engine's first slow churn to life. "You listen close today, lad. She'll tell you when she's done enough. Bring her home before she begs you." Thomas nodded, hand pressed to the warm metal, feeling the hum of the Merlin's waking heartbeat through the leather of his glove. A short distance away, Jem swung himself into his own cockpit with a grin that turned toward Harry, who lingered beside his wing, helmet tucked against his ribs. "Stick close today, Harry boy," Jem called through the churn of engines rising one by one. "No fancy heroics. If Tommy here tries to outfly you, kick his rudder for me." Harry gave a shy, crooked smile, lips moving around words Thomas did not hear but felt settle like a stone that did not sink. The green flare arced over the dispersal hut, a pale star in a dawn that had not yet made up its mind whether to clear or close again. Throttles opened, wheels pulled free of mud and steel. Wings rose into the waiting blue like prayers half remembered but never quite forgotten. They crossed the channel low, engines stitched together by the headsets, soft static and clipped calls. Bearings checked, airspeed held steady, the hum of 100 small confidences traded without breath. Beneath them, the sea rolled silver in the break of dawn, indifferent as ever to the thin shapes that dared its hush. When the French coast rose to meet them, the bombers came into view. Slow, dark shapes droning toward the docks, where cranes bristled against the horizon like spears, waiting for the chance to wound. Flak rose in lazy black blossoms at first, then quickened, peppering the sky with sudden claws of shrapnel that rattled through wingtips and cowling. Jem's voice came sharp, bright as always. "Here we go, Tommy. Time to dance, lad." Thomas smiled behind his mask, a small flicker he did not fight. He banked right into the climbing arc that would slide his Spitfire above the bombers' broad backs, eyes scanning for the first flicker of enemy wings in the morning glare. They came in pairs, Messerschmitts tumbling out of cloud breaks, sharp and eager. The air filled with the stutter of guns, the tracer lines crossing like threads of fire spun too tight to see until they snapped past the canopy glass. Harry's voice broke the rush. "One low port side, see him!" Thomas rolled, felt the Spitfire's ribs shudder as he looped to meet the threat. Jem's guns barked behind him, the sky blooming with the sudden, ugly flower of a fuel tank splitting open in mid-turn. For seconds that felt like hours, the world shrank to the roar of the Merlin, the stiff pulse of the stick in his hands, the glimpse of the channel's hush far below, waiting like a soft dare. Tracer fire scored the belly of his wing, but did not find his heart. Then came the echo in his headset. Harry's voice, calm and fierce at once. "I've got your back, sir. I see him. He's peeling." They climbed out together, the bombers already dropping their cargo in neat lines of thunder that rolled across the cranes and sheds like the distant promise of an ending yet to come. When the order came to turn for home, Thomas found his wingmen tucked tight. Jem's grin flickering in the mirror. Harry's canopy glinting steady behind the battered Spitfire that still flew because she had decided the day owed them a landing more than it owed the sea another name to keep. They crossed the channel in a hush, broken only by the wind. The airfield rose to meet them like a patch of memory stitched to the ragged cloth of the coast. When his wheels kissed the strip, Thomas let the Merlin run down slow. He sat there in the cockpit long after the propeller ticked itself to silence. Boots braced on the rudder pedals, as if he needed to feel the Spitfire's bones beneath his own, just a heartbeat longer. On the hardstand, Merton waited, cap in hand, shoulders squared against the wind. Beside him stood Graham, and further off the Padre, the faintest curl of smoke lifting from the battered chimney of his little hut by the fence. Thomas climbed down last. Boots met earth. His hand lingered on the wing's warm skin, patched, bent, never quite the same, but still enough. Jem's laugh rolled in behind him. Harry's boots squelched softly beside his own. Above them, the channel breathed its endless hush. The sky overhead held no promise, but the thin truth they carried home in the roar of engines gone quiet, that they would rise again when called, wings stitched together by courage, oil, and the stubborn, trembling hope that tomorrow's sky might still be theirs to write.